Just was sent out. Hey, Sushi.
Hey.
Welcome. Long time no see. Hi, Iñaki. Thank you for being here. We're going to wait a few minutes. I believe I just sent the students the link to the Zoom meeting. I sent it to everybody else in the universe, but not the people that actually are the ones who are to be reviewed. Sounds about right. But anyways, we'll give them a couple minutes, and then once everybody's here, I'll do a brief introduction of the studio, our critics, and introduce our students to our esteemed guests.
Ben, do you happen to have a preference of how the students watch who are not going today? Do you want them to be on Zoom or YouTube? Do you have a preference?
The thesis students?
Yeah, I just got an text.
Oh, so. I think actually in here is great.
Okay, I'll text. I just wanted to make sure.
Yeah. They were probably just confused by my temporary lapse of. Y'all got, looks like Casey and Henry got my email a second ago. Way to be on top of your machines. Welcome, Carol. Wonderful to see you.
Ben, are we going in the order that appears in the packet?
Great to be here.
Yes. So, and I'll just wait a couple more minutes and then I'll introduce everybody and just say a few words about the studio.
Wait, Ben, the pamphlet's in alphabetical order and you have me going first.
Oh, sorry. The order is the order that I had established in the email. The pamphlet is just alphabetical order by student. So we will be going in the order of the email that I sent to the critics with the numerals 1, 2, 3, 4. So I believe it's Kaylin, Henry, Michael, and Xiaolan.
Am I going second or am I going third? I thought the email said I was going third, but I could.
Whatever the email said, I don't have it in front of me right now.
I think Michael was second, Ben.
Okay, Michael,
and Henry
you're second.
Third.
Kaylin, Michael, Henry, Xiaolan. Let's see. We have Michael, we have Henry, we have Xiaolan, we have Kaylin, we have all of the faculty, and we have all of the critics with the exception of Summers. He is on a review at Berkeley also today, so he may be joining us a little bit later. So I think we should start without Marty, and I'll do an introduction of Marty once he gets here. But thanks, everybody. First, I just want to say thank you. This has been a wild semester, I'm sure, for everybody. And I'm so appreciative of our faculty, our students, and especially our critics for making the time to join us today in what is 2 semesters of work with an amazing collection of graduate students. So we are at Tulane School of Architecture, and this is graduate thesis. We have 8 students in the program, 8 students in the thesis sequence. In my email that I sent the other night, I had stated that graduate thesis is optional. We do that for a number of reasons, but one of them is that in some of the cases, the students wouldn't have design build opportunities that would otherwise be unavailable to them. So thesis is optional for our graduate students. But 8 brave souls took it upon themselves to engage in thesis this year. We have restructured the thesis sequence from previous versions of it. Previously, our graduates and undergraduates were working together on thesis. This year is the first cycle of total delamination from the undergraduate program. During the summer, the students were paired with a faculty member based on their research interests, and hopefully aligning themselves with faculty members' research areas. And they began the fall semester working in a 3-credit-hour thesis research course where they developed a research proposal by the end of the semester and presented that in December. And then this semester has been a continuation of that work in what would be a more traditional kind of design studio atmosphere. I will say that because this is very independent in nature, there is no set studio hours, for example. So each of the faculty would meet with their students on their own schedule. So for example, last fall, I actually met with my students in a coffee shop because I was not teaching last semester, so I wasn't on campus. So we would meet for 1 hour each week, one-on-one, and discuss the projects. This semester, in my case, I would meet with each of the students 2 hours each during the semester. So, you know, we would have intensive 1-hour discussions on Tuesdays and Thursdays. So the contact hours are split a little bit differently than a traditional studio format, but it's very one-on-one, it's self-motivated, it's self-directed, but really overseen in close proximity to the faculty director. If there are any questions about the sequence, obviously feel free to reach out. I mean, ask me any questions you have while we're going through this throughout the day. But the faculty who have been leading these students this semester include Scott Bernard. I believe he has his screen currently off, or the video stream currently off, but Scott is here joining us. Kentaro Tsubaki, Emily Taylor-Welty, and Ann Yoakum, and then me. And so Anne had 2 students, Brandon Sertain and Seneca Gray. Kentaro had 1 student, Xiaolan Mengning Lan. Emily Taylor-Welty had 1 student, Kaylin Fowler. Scott Bernard had 2 students, Henry Brereton and Michael Heitz. And I had 2 students, Lucy Satsowicz and Casey Last. And I'll just briefly introduce our critics. So today we have joining us Iñaki Alde, the Dean at Tulane School of Architecture. Thank you so much for being here. Richard Campanella, also at Tulane University. Thank you, Rich. Always a pleasure to get you on reviews. Yasushi Ishida from Cal Poly Pomona. I'll introduce our outside critics with a little bit more detail. Yasushi I've known for years. We first knew each other by doing area calculations of all strange things, but we worked together for a number of years and have followed each other's careers for the last several when we migrated to academia and teaching. And he's been teaching at Woodbury, Cal Poly, and I believe a few other places. Was here actually a couple of years ago for a workshop. And Yasushi, thank you for having me on your review on Saturday and Sunday. It was a real treat. We have Elizabeth Kislacey, who is also a former colleague of mine from University of Michigan, a tremendous scholar, recently won JAE Article of the Year Award, amongst many other accolades, is trained as a professional architect, but has migrated to history, historian and theorist. So thank you, Liz, for making the time today. Betsy Holt Johnson. Betsy, this is the first time we've actually met, so I don't have your bio memorized, but you were brought to my attention by, I believe, a mutual colleague of ours, Nick Jenish. And I understand you were a Tulane alum and are now at University of Colorado Boulder. I really appreciate you making the time today. You came highly, highly recommended. So thank you so much for being here. And we also have Carol Reese from Tulane University, another resident historian and scholar on the panel. Thank you so much for joining us, Carol. And Marty Summers, I believe he will be joining us later. So we'll hold off for Marty's introduction, but also another colleague of Yasushi and mine and Yasushi's from our professional days, and another architect who's transitioned into academia, and he's at University of Kentucky. So without further ado, unless if there are any sort of operational questions, the format for this is the students will present for 15 minutes. And then we will have 30 additional minutes for discussion. So 45 minutes in total. We're getting a little bit of a late start. We couldn't start right at 2. Obviously, we had to do a little bit of discussion first. So we might go over a little bit. Hope we'll try to stay on time as best we can. We only have 4 students to review today, but we should probably jump into that as soon as possible. And would you mind being official timekeeper? You have been the master at that, and for whatever reason, time management is not my strength. And
do you want me to hold up a sign, Ben, when we're at 3 to Kaylin, like just like this? That's awkward, but
I think that's great.
Okay, at the 3-minute mark.
Or you could just enter it into the chat.
Okay, well, to look is hard to look down.
I've been finding that the best timekeeping reminders are to just use your your annotation tools and put the text right on the screen. I just write 1 minute left or something and leave it on there for a second or 2, and that way people can see it regardless of what their screen is sharing is doing.
Brilliant. That's awesome. Thank you, Scott. Okay, Kaylin, are you ready to rock and roll? I think I have to give you hosting status. So I'll give our 4 students that will be presenting today some hosting status here. And all of the critics, you should have a link to the presentations that the students had produced. And hopefully you'll have reviewed those or have had the opportunity to take a look at them. If not, it's okay. Inshallah. Great. All right.
We're good to go?
We are good to go. Thank you, Kaylin.
Yeah, sorry, just my bad. Okay, hi everyone. I am Kaylin Fowler, and I've had the privilege of working with Emily Taylor Welty for the last year on the Maker Synergy, building communities through collaborative design. Human beings have an innate urge to use their hands and build, but most are not given the opportunity, education, or resources to do so. I'm grateful that I've had the opportunity and education to maximize my personal design build experience over the past 6 years of architecture school. As you can see, design build is a collaborative effort with many moving parts. If my design build experience and research has taught me anything, it is that there are challenges and accomplishments in every project that this pedagogical model regards. In many readings and discussions, design build education separates stakeholders often into the community, the profession, and academia. It is important to recognize that all 3 of these categories live within a larger context of a shared capital C community, whereas the community here is referring to those who are not in other categories, but seek to be involved in the design build process. Looking at the cross intersections of these adjacent programs, you can see design build, public interest design, and design centers operate in between certain categories. And within these titles, there are many programs and many hybrid maker models that exist, and yet there are people who are still excluded from the process. I would challenge you to question what can happen when you begin to strip down those barriers and remove the inherently hierarchical design titles of stakeholders, and instead look at the intersection of all of these groups. And then go a step further in prioritizing an equitable system that views all people as makers on a spectrum of varying skills, knowledge, and expertise in one common place of intersection, and to intersect at the Maker Synergy. The Maker Synergy is the interaction or collaboration of 2 or more maker organizations, group of makers, or individual makers to produce a combined effect greater than the sum of their separate effects within their shared community. On the topic of research in design build, Dan Rockhill, Studio 804 director, says it is difficult to quantitatively measure the benefits of design build education. Instead, taking advantage of the qualitative rich description within design build publications, a case study analysis was done in order to both praise and critique design build pedagogical approaches and to inform a new hybrid model that is inclusive to community building. Focusing on US-based educational models, these case studies went through an extraction process of their mission statements, areas of interest, and areas of improvement. At the culmination of the extraction of the mission statements, you can see that there is a clear hierarchy and emphasis on building community design students. The case study research and the conception of a maker synergy has helped develop a framework of questions, including how can design build education be more accessible and impactful? How can all community members play a hands-on participatory role in what is being built in their neighborhood? How can you compile and reflect upon design build's past? And what will that reflection inform as a result? The Maker Synergy seeks to propose adapted and new design build education systems through the production of the Maker Synergy Handbook to act as an accessible tool that promotes a future where communities can utilize the people, resources, and knowledge of existing universities, partner with the expertise of community members, and the experience of professional designers and builders to teach, learn, reflect, design, build, collaborate, and make for, in, and with their shared communities. This research has also allowed me to encounter a multitude of publications like handbooks and how-to manuals, but there is still a lacking of comprehensive reflection of design build programs balanced through the lens of both critique and praise. Reflection is necessary to inform new adaptations and systems. This has inspired the production of the Maker Synergy Handbook, a handbook reflecting on design build's past to inform a more accessible and impactful community design build future. As you can see in the table of contents, the handbook begins with an introduction to the Maker Synergy and the colors and graphics. It goes on to include a design build lexicon as well as a selected history and pointing out common design build areas of interest and improvement. It's these areas of interest and improvement that have helped inform the case study analysis in the learning from design build's past. These areas of interest and improvement then go on to include specific built projects, which were selected for a further description. These programs and systems then inform the second half of the handbook, which is creating a new design build future where the Maker Synergy systems are laid out. A key area of improvement that has come up across this research involves time, and whether that time involves struggling with being confined by semester schedules or faculty and students spending extra time on a project which takes away from other work. In the case of Rural Studio, one of the figurehead design build programs in the world, they have completed more than 200 projects and educated more than 1,000 citizen architects. One of those projects, as seen in this spread of the handbook, is the New Bern Firehouse. That is a 4,000 square foot firehouse that took a group of 4 fifth-year Auburn students over 2 years to complete. In regards to time at Rural Studio, current director Andrew Freer is proud of the extra time that his students put in as volunteers, as seen in the quote in the bottom of the spread. Another key area of improvement that has been seen across university programs is a lack of opportunities for community partners to participate in the design and build process. For the past 15 years, the Tulane Small Center for Collaborative Design has focused on equitable process and excellence through their built projects and visioning projects. Last semester, as seen in this spread, the Small Center students were challenged to a 2-week blitz build with the interior space of the Yep Design Works new storefront. The Small Center students and the Yep designers collaboratively designed the scheme of the project together in the first week, but when it came time to build, the Yep designers went on in their graphic design work and Tulane students went into the shop and began to build. There was a clear barrier of where community partners could participate and where they could not. Tulane student said, if we built the project together, the Yep builders would have had more power in the finished outcome of the space that is ultimately theirs. I don't think that training them on basic building tools would have been much of an issue. Looking at another design center that has sparked a unique area of interest was Dot Agency. Dot Agency has worked with 23 community partners and has dedicated their work to research and to the improvement of low quality of public health in the Wyandotte community in Kansas City. In the conception of the agency, founder Nils Gore and Shannon Chris agreed that community access and collaboration would be an integral part of Dot's work. You can see this through the use of their storefront, which was built out by the KU architecture students on a storefront that was donated by the Wyandotte County. And Dot Agency has agreed to participate in a 20 keys concept. And in the quote, they reflect on this concept by saying that anyone who has a compelling idea for how the space could be used would be given a key. At the middle of this handbook, you can find this content connections as a transition, which expresses that there is not one clear cause and effect from case study to new system. Rather, a multitude of the case studies will influence the maker synergy systems. One of those systems includes an equitable schedule. So looking at how community members find involvement in design build, that normally includes maker spaces or incubators where they can participate in weekly workshops, weekend seminars, or monthly camps. Looking at a typical academic schedule with 4-month semesters, you normally either operate within a 1 semester or 2 semester design build, and often there's a summer semester also allowed. And then within talking about the profession, you can start to see larger projects taking up spans of time between 6 months or a year or even longer. And when you start to combine parts of those schedules, specifically when you start to take the monthly camps and the 4-month semesters and distribute them within those longer professional projects, you can start to find overlaps and intersections where people can begin to collaborate and work together. And moving into the Maker Synergy proposal, where you also take the weekly workshops and the weekend seminars and integrate them into the 6-month projects and to the year-long projects. It is the proposal that the synergy schedule would ease the extra workload that most design build participants feel and spread an array of knowledge across a variety of participants who walk into this process. You can see how that is laid out within the handbook here. Another topic going into the Maker Synergy involves context. Every design build program is affected by its context. The Maker Synergy is a system that can be adapted to its location and the makers, but the intention here is to ground the Maker Synergy in Buffalo, New York, and create a collaborative maker system that can play a role in the revitalization of a Rust Belt city. When discussing Rust Belt cities, Phil Enquist, SOM's previous head of global planning, asked, "Doesn't it make sense to reinvest in our urban past?" And the Maker Synergy aims to do exactly that through collaboration of universities within Buffalo. You can see the University of Buffalo here, SUNY Buff State here, and Erie County Community College here, as well as with other maker models within the city, Assembly House 150, as well as the maker's space of the Foundry here. And also integrating in architecture and design firms that are dispersed between downtown all the way into North Buffalo, ranging in scale. But of course, when talking about accessibility to the community, you have to take into account public transportation. You can see here, Main Street acts as the core NFTA metro line for the city of Buffalo. And looking at all of these resources, you start to try and look for the zone of intersection, which would hypothetically happen here within the city, with allowing for bus access to this zone as well. The intent of this zone would be to be a starting point for the Maker Synergy to promote collaboration in the community of Buffalo. You can see how that's laid out within the handbook here. Another proposal within the Maker Synergy handbook includes mapping design build. As previously mentioned, quantitative data is hard to come by within design build research, and few programs have attempted to or made public their way of mapping their program. The Maker Synergy has attempted a first pass at a mapping system using the stakeholder concept from earlier, as well as trying to overlay analytical data inspired by a typical soil diagram. Here you can see an example using the Detroit Collaborative Design Center. The mapping system aims to ask questions that would ideally be answered by the program or accessible through the publications or on their websites. So this example is asking who participates in the process, what is the structure of the program, what is the program for, and where does this operation take place? The intent is to find the answers again with publications or to reach out to those maker systems in order to then synthesize the answers of those questions and compare them to the Maker Synergy zone. It is the intent that this zone would always be acting as a way to check for inclusivity and accessibility within your program. You can see that mapped out here in the handbook, as well as steps in order to replicate and use this system moving forward. The last system that will be discussed includes the design build charrette. So the Maker Synergy promotes all makers to participate in design build efforts within their community. And this is a daunting task to people who have never existed or operated in the world of designing or building. The Maker Synergy charrette is a small scale on-ramp for democratizing design build. With this 6-card deck, you can find the introduction cards, a letter from a fellow maker encouraging participation, as well as the understanding of a facilitator who would really be organizing the charrette, leading to the makers. And these titles of the makers are in no way meant to be boundaries, but instead starting points for makers to get involved, leading into the design charrette, which focuses on talking about public space and an issue that exists in that public space and trying to collaboratively come up with a solution, which finalizes in the attempt of a final scale mock-up. And this in no way is to be able to replace design build education, but rather just to foster the on-ramp of an experience. And of course, the resource cards to make these cards accessible to people who aren't used to the terminology on the cards. And the handbook contains not only the cards, but also 2 examples of completed design build charrettes that reflect on the power of collaboration, accessible language, engagement, and much more. As you can see, we've only discussed a third of the handbook's contents, but the Maker Synergy has sought to propose adapted and new design build education systems through the production of the Maker Synergy handbook. The handbook acts as an accessible tool that promotes a future where communities utilize all stakeholders in every aspect of the process, and the reflection and analysis of the extraction allows for key studies to help inform new systems in the Maker Synergy proposal. And the answers to the original questions are still multifaceted, but this manifesto that the handbook now is steps in the directions of answers and theorizes them through these systems. And this handbook is in no way the conclusion of the body of this research. However, it is instead a slight pivot in the discipline to point towards a more reflective and adaptable pedagogical model. The community-wide implications of accessing this education are endless and will hopefully encourage more individuals to begin to aim to synergize. It is up to the current makers to advocate for the sharing of these resources. If put into action, the systems proposed by the Maker Synergy and the Maker Synergy Handbook have the potential to provide a more accessible, inclusive, and impactful community design build future. Thank you very much.
Kaylin, one question. Is your thesis, sorry for the question, but when you are looking at the processes of design build or at the education on design build?
Looking at the educational model of design build. So within educational systems, not within the actual practice of design build in a firm. So always under the pedagogical model of design build.
You know, I have a question kind of following along the same lines. In your, I think it was the triangle, you described the community, the profession or professionals and academics. And I guess I was curious where students fall in that triangular map. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, sorry. Terminology that was meant to be used was just academia. So that's involving students and faculty within design build. Yeah, so that was always meant to be students and faculty. And they're also blurring between those lines. Of course, there are practicing faculty members. Yeah.
Kaylin, do you think that it could, the assessment of collaborative public interest design, or really any sort of academic civic engagement, can ever truly be done quantitatively? Or are you kind of ready to accept that maybe qualitatively might be the best we can do, and perhaps even better, period?
I would like to test the theory of quantitatively measuring impact. I mean, that's being done with programs who are definitely focused within sustainability. They're finding other ways to measure. Yeah, I would like to test the theory for sure to see if that's possible. the more programs that I have the opportunity to hopefully be involved in. I do think that qualitative research is rich and has given a lot, but I wouldn't say that I've found many universities that are always even recording qualitative information. So ideally, if there was a quantitative model, I just think that more programs would be using it.
Well, let me ask a follow-up question then.
Mm-hmm.
If the amount of time and effort and funds in measuring those successes quantitative or those actions quantitatively comes at the expense of the actual execution of the whole effort to begin with, is it worth it?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. I would put priority in finishing the project rather than collecting the quantitative data. But ideally, there would be researchers and builders working together during that process. Ideally, that's where that overlap would happen.
Thank you.
A question about space. We have kind of a design build studio here at CU Boulder, and our campus is pretty landlocked, as is Boulder. We have the mountains and we have pretty clear boundaries to the city. So one thing we've come up against is the space needed for all of the shops, the facilities that the students want. So we've looked at potentially sharing spaces with people across campus. Did you explore any opportunity to maybe share with like engineering, for example, or other departments that might have maker spaces, or how that can impact a campus?
So in terms of this system, there was going to be an extra step of testing more of the design charrettes using different spaces across the city of Buffalo. That was always a plan in testing the charrette in multiple different making spaces across the city of Buffalo to see where really meets that intersection. But due to different constraints, kind of the handbook has become a means in which for others to be tackling that in their spaces. And talking directly to the city of Buffalo, I do think that there are spaces that could be adapted and reused, and there are already existing spaces that are being made in that process. So in the context that I've looked at, there is kind of an uptick on those collaborative models, but there are still restrictions depending on, for example, University of Buffalo being a public institution. Anyone who takes the safety course has access to use those facilities, no matter who they are. Whereas at a private university, that is not always the option.
Eileen, can you go to the page of your preface?
The page of what?
The preface of your, well, there's a place where you have the three diagrams compared.
Yep. Like the original diagrams?
The people, these diagrams of community, profession, and academia,
yep,
that morphs into makers, and makers.
Mm-hmm. Do you want the first one?
Yeah, well, if you have the three of them together, it's in.
I don't have the three of them together, sorry.
So what is the role of expertise?
I think that as of right now, the role of expertise, ideally, the goal of this is to be democratizing the system of design build education. So expertise in typical design build, I would say, is falling in the pedagogical model, is falling on normally one faculty member who's leading that charge that students are following. And the idea moving forward, looking at these different models, community and profession, normally in public interest design, the community is defaulting to the profession. In design build, with sub-consultants, professionals are also coming in for reviews when taking part in design build on campuses. And then within design centers, I do think there is definitely more engagement that is equaling the playing field of expertise and defaulting on community members. And then moving forward into this system, ideally there would be people within the system who have expertise within each category and would be able to bring that expertise to synergize. So actually removing the idea that one category has expertise. I think that some people are coming with expertise in context. Some people are coming in expertise with connections and actual building details. And some people could be coming into expertise with how to teach and how to make this mode of education accessible. So ideally, each group is turning in from separate and being thought as of separate to actually leveling the playing field and democratizing design build.
But you are still explaining that even if they are coming from different circles and you are giving them the same name, you are actually differentiating what is the expertise of each of these groups. So what is I'm not clear in.
Yeah, I can scroll down to the cards, try and attempt to talk about this a little bit further. So, sorry. So in terms of the community member and during their transition of just being thought as one of the stakeholders, the charrette tries to break them down to a placemaker. So a maker that knows the current context and people in that location. So they're able to bring the expertise of knowing the context. And then the creation maker is going through design techniques and processes, and then really thinking about structure maker and understanding and people who are well-versed in building as a career. So architecture and design professionals. And yeah, I think that is definitely the idea of one sole like expert. I don't think is cleared in this system yet. And I don't know if it ever will be in this conceptual idea, which is why a next step would actually be to test certain systems and start to derive what and where of the process do different people act as expert.
How many cards are there?
There are 6 cards.
So I wasn't too prepared to, I was kind of waiting to critique a project. So I don't know how good of a job I can do on critiquing of the finished book. It's also kind of hard to always critique the finished project. So I would kind of treat it as an ongoing thing,
Of course.
as if you were to develop further. So the carding idea was really interesting for me in terms of handbook that's serving as a guideline for people who wants to do design build. Personally, I've recently helped out at a firm working on, they're trying to put together like a drawing, quality management drawing manual, basically, intended for like a junior designer to follow certain guidelines so that they don't make crazy drawings, right? Their drawings looks decently following the firm standard. There was a dilemma of, it was spearheaded by this very knowledgeable senior staff. I was kind of assisting him. It always had this trap of turning into a dissertation, right? So there was a chapter on building section, and it was like a 5-page document. And the question is like, who's going to read this, right? And so I was having a discussion with another person who used to be at a similar role. So the person that I was helping was in this school of, he wants to put together this complete document that has all the guidelines. And then the other person I was talking to, he believes in any kind of office manual has to be a maximum 1-page 11x17 paper, so that otherwise your 500 staff is never going to read it. So that was kind of the anxiety is not the good word, but like slightly getting worried as I was sort of following, the book is great as your final product for your thesis, but if you intend that as a practical document, I thought it was kind of heavy-handed. So this card thing, I'm like personally really intrigued to see this card developed further. It kind of reminded me of, I was trying to find it in the bookshelf, maybe you have even looked at it, is, oh, my background doesn't help in this case. But there was this ideal. This came out a long time ago. I think it was like 2005. It's called Ideal Method Cars. Ideal is like a product design consulting firm. There was a term called design thinking that was a buzzword for maybe 5 years. I'm not gonna try to explain it, but it's basically a deck of cars that's not intended strictly as a manual, but to start any kind of design project, it's supposed to inspire the team, right? Like it could be just like randomly pulled out from the deck, and they would come with like these sort of images paired with one concept, and apparently there are like 4 different categories, and so this can sort of like trigger a discussion in the team. So your card seems very much like this. So I guess I just want to compliment on that one. Like I really intrigued to see more of these, because I can imagine the design team meeting the first day, sort of like trying to tackle the problem, and then just like it could be ordered or not ordered, but maybe if you have like 20 cars, you can just like pull out one and sort of discuss what everyone's, what their expectation is. I'm pretty sure everyone has different expectations, so like aligning them is helpful, and et cetera, et cetera. And I would mute myself before my baby cries.
Yeah, thank you for the resource.
Maybe I'll just chime in. I'm still kind of formulating a response to the project, which, I mean, by the way, is like beautifully designed. I mean, you've done a lot of research, and all of that is really evident in what you've presented. So I congratulate you on all of your hard work. My question about where the students fit in to the scheme really had to do with getting at not only, because I think your project really gets to like what different people in their different roles bring to the project. But I do wonder about what it is that each of these groups are seeking to get out of the project, right? And this gets to maybe questions about the role of design build in kind of architectural pedagogy in general, particularly in light of like the situation we all now find ourselves in, where everything is virtual.
Yeah.
And so like, what is the value of actually touching things and assembling things and working next to community members, in a world where all of that is difficult, if not impossible. And so, I mean, I do wonder about, if the self-interest of each of the groups like enters into the equation, like students are not only just going out there and doing these things for altruistic reasons. It's like you want to learn something, which sometimes those educational opportunities might come at the expense of efficiency, or like the best possible product for the so there's something that everyone gives up in order to participate in the project. And I mean, I'm just curious how that maybe factors into what you've done.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful question, and that's something I've been thinking about through every project I've had the privilege of working on. And for students in particular, I think that there is a disconnect often in transitioning to the role into the professional practice. And I think that for some people who do get involved in kind of developing empathy as a designer, which I think is kind of, if you're looking at a student who's able to engage with the community, I do think that there's value in becoming an empathic designer. And I think just through designing with more people and diversifying that team, that you're engaging with that. And I do think that there is sometimes the stronghold disconnect that students find themselves within the first year of becoming professionals. So in the model, in the booklet, there is a specific page on makers, and it does try and also incorporate incentive into the idea. So at DCDC, Detroit Collaborative Design Center, they're a case study that acts as a nonprofit architecture and design firm that hires 3 student interns and also compensates them for their work and also gives them experience hours to further their license, so that not only are they acting in this kind of community way and engaging with community members, but also receiving experience hours that are going to further their hopeful professional practice. So definitely drawing a lot from them in the model of where does student lie. I think that community members are already building things and filling their potholes in front of their houses when they need to, and are definitely engaging in, some people are engaging in the built environment who have had the privilege of being raised with woodshop classes or going to vocational schools, who might not always be the respected voice in the room in these conversations. So I think they're gaining a voice. And then I think professionals who are disheartened by some of the work that they do that isn't engaging with the community, or professionals who struggle with, do I continue to practice or do I go teach? I think it's creating kind of a bridge in which they can be involved with students and community members, but also be kind of engaging in their community's built environment outside of their design professional work.
Carol, I believe you have your hand raised.
I did raise my hand.
Hey, Carol.
Kaylin, hello. So I don't know what, oh, am I muted? No, I'm not muted. Okay.
No, I hear you.
Okay, great. So I mean, I think this is just beautifully presented, but I'd like to sort of go back to what I perceive to be the directions of Inyaki's questions, and they're mine too, that I would love to hear you just lay out very forcefully why leveling the playing field is necessary. And when I ask myself that question, and I wonder, you know, what that question has meant to you, why do we need to do this? Why is this synergy project necessary to do this? Then, you know, what's the result of leveling the playing field? Is it, I suppose it's both these things, both to make design build projects more successful and also to make design build education more successful. And so that leads me then to the final sort of way of rounding this up. Can you imagine this handbook as treating everyone equally? In other words, not really going in the direction of emphasis that you said was your project for the thesis, and I know you need to narrow in order to, you know, complete the thesis. But the next iteration of this, you know, sort of producing this model so that it weaves everyone in together equally in the way that you say is your goal.
Yeah, those are wonderful questions that I'm sure I'm going to be tackling for the next 10 to 15 years. But to start, I would say that through leveling the playing field, I do think that there are designers that will disagree with that idea, and that we do have a set of skills that we have, and a service like architects provide a service. But I think there is value in widening just who has access to that service. So just looking at like systemic reasons for people not having access to higher education, which limits who is going into the architecture profession, which is limiting, or who's going into school for architecture, which limits then who goes into the profession. So I do think over the years we've seen an improvement in diversifying who is even at the table within architecture. But I still think that there are many strides to continue to take. And that's just talking about the architecture profession in general, not necessarily design build. Talking about how to actually, like the benefits of equaling the playing field, and if that is possible, yeah, ideally that is the next step in testing these systems. So the conclusion of the book is in this present time, and a next chapter of that handbook would be the tested systems and the failures and improvements, the failures and successes, which I do think that if this handbook stands as anything, it at least stands as a tool of reflection, which I don't think design build education does well. I think that there is an emphasis on finishing a project, celebrating the finishing of a project, and then moving on. So if minimally what comes out of this is just like a sense of pause for design build education to begin a state of reflection, because many systems have not changed since the conception of Yale's building project and Rural Studio. Most systems are just small adaptations to things that those two figurehead programs, at least in the United States, have started. So minimally, I would like this to cause more reflection. And in terms of like the equity within the process, I've had the privilege of working with people who don't have backgrounds in design build education who have brought more to the table than I have in conversations. So I think I'm biased by personal experience as well. I hope that answered some of your questions, Carol.
Thank you. Thank you.
I think we have time for one more question, and then we've got to keep moving on. Am I accurate with that, Anne?
Yes, this should be definitely the last one.
All right, and I think I saw Inyaki's hand go up first. There are 3 currently raised. I'm sorry we won't be able to get to all of the comments, but Inyaki, you have the last words.
Wow, what a responsibility. So thinking, I'm trying to get my head around. First, I think that the role of a thesis is to be a springboard of your career. And I think that might be very well the case, and it might be a very successful thesis in that regard. And I think you have taken that seriously, and I really appreciate that, because not always, this is obvious, but it's not always the case. I also applaud like the critical approach that you have to the design build model. I'm not completely sure about the diagnostic that you are doing. And let me explain. I think my sense is that I'm much more interested in the cards also, as not for the cars itself, but because it's maybe the beginning of what would be the core of your contribution. I have the sense that the first part of the presentation is a little bit too rhetoric, and a little bit, I hope you take it well, but a little bit of preconceptions or assumptions. So what does leveling the field means, or what equal treatment means? And the diagram of the 3 makers all in blue is a kind of moral statement in that sense. But then when you go to the different colors, you go back to the idea that, and the card, that there's a series of expertise that are very important. There are different kind of contributions. So then everything becomes a little bit more complex. Not everyone is the same, not everyone is equal, and thankfully the differences are what brings the richness, no? And why are not someone more important than others? Actually, the ones who are going to receive the thing or are going to use are probably the most important components. No? So this kind of moral preassumptions is something that I'm less convinced. And I think that what this promises is a serious development of a methodology in which you can develop the key pieces, no? Because there's only one set of cards here, but if you were saying, okay, let me see what is the set of cards of how you identify the stakeholders, how you diagnose the issues, how do you find the references for what you are doing or wanting to do, how do you lay out the options, how do you choose and eventually correct this choice, how do you iterate and you develop and you critique, no? Then how you build and how you correct in the building, and then how you finish, and then how you evaluate, no? Each of these steps, and I'm sure I'm missing some, have a kind of set of cards or a process, no? That you are carefully choreographing. So my sense is that this is the promise of really going very deep into building a series of feedback loops between many the different pieces. And maybe your diagram, instead of having 3 blue bubbles and into a mix of different colors in the map, instead of 3 bubbles that are same color separated.
Yeah,
this makes sense.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you for the feedback. And just sorry, Anne, just quickly, the intention was always that these cards were going to be edited as examples of the charrette were performed this semester. So within the first example, the cards then went through an editing, and then after the second charrette example, the cards went through an editing. So it was always going to become this kind of continuous loop. And there is an edit of the cards that is pandemic friendly that has been emailed out to people. So there are constant feedback loops, at least during the duration of this semester. But I really appreciate that comment.
Thank you, Kaylin. It's been a pleasure to watch you work on this. You came into the school with an interest in design build and you followed it all the way through. I'm really proud of your diligence and commitment to a subject. And we need to jump to the next student. And Michael, are you ready to rock and roll here?
Yeah, I'm all set.
Great. Take us away. Thank you, Kaylin.
Thank you, everyone.
Can you guys see that?
Yep.
Okay. All right. My name is Michael Heitz. My thesis is titled Multiplying the Inhabitable Plane. 1 second. The sea level rise defense. I'll start with my thesis statement, which is to resolve New York City's bleak future in a world of extreme climate change. This thesis proposes a network of elevated parks, pedestrian walkways, and public transportation that project from the ground plane and weave between buildings. This network of corridors overlap at different levels and must be implemented without undermining the viability of the existing ground plane in order to protect against flooding, decrease congestion, increase economic activity, and create the city model of the future. I chose to focus my research on New York City, specifically Lower Manhattan, which is the most vulnerable area to flooding, but also the most valuable area of the city. New York City in total has a population of 8.6 million and produces 8% of this country's GDP, which is a number comparable to Canada and North Korea. This map illustrates flood hazard zones of 2020 in dark blue and projected flood zones of 2180 years with the light blue, engulfing a good portion of Lower Manhattan. New York was made aware of this vulnerability in 2012 with Hurricane Sandy, which flooded 17% of New York City, did 19 billion worth of damages, and 61 billion was spent on Sandy relief effort. It damaged streets, damaged neighborhoods, and in the bottom 2 photos, you see the damage it did to the subway.
Hey, Michael, sorry to interrupt. I just want to point out, it looks as though, at least on my screen, there's a big gray window obscuring some of the imagery.
Yeah, mine too. It's happening.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
It's gone now. Thanks. Sorry for the interruption.
No worries. Thank you for pointing that out. The New York City subway is already in poor condition with structural cracks, constant delays, thousands of reports each day, pumps 13 million gallons of water out each day. By 2120, it's projected that because of sea level rise and increased frequency of storm surges, a majority of the subway lines in Lower Manhattan will be completely flooded, which is represented in the dark blue. in the dark blue lines on the map. So what is the city doing about this issue? They are implementing, starting this year, a Manhattan resiliency projects, which is split into two projects, which take the perimeter parks around the lower Manhattan and landfill them by 10 feet to create a protective levee or berm. But the problem with this solution is that it is said by the officials to only protect the city until 2050, so it is not a long-term solution. In conclusion of the research, if New York City is subject to sea level rise and giant flood barriers aren't a long-term solution and the subway will be untenable due to flooding, then the city faces a serious threat of decline and should explore design implications of an elevated infrastructure and opportunities for elevated public spaces. This thesis will reimagine a portion of the city in 2100 that encompasses future development that multiplies activity into vertical layers. The site that I've chosen for the intervention is a neighborhood called Two Bridges, which got its name due to its adjacency to the Brooklyn Bridge. It lies in that flood vulnerable city on the edge, and it is adjacent to the high rises of downtown Manhattan. Mostly it's made up of cruciform apartment buildings, small businesses, a recreation center, a lot of green space, and also highly accessible because of its adjacency to a couple of different highway systems. But instead of just creating hypothetical structures and forms, I've decided to place examples of contemporary development on the site and replace the buildings that are there now. The first being the phase one development of Hudson Yards. And while they create issues of gentrification and foreign asset dumping, they still represent what contemporary development looks like in New York. And then the Salesforce Center on the bottom, which is a transit center and public roof park in San Francisco that spans 4 blocks long and is 4.5 acres long. The programs of these buildings include housing, both affordable and not, offices, retail, hotel, fitness center, restaurants, performing arts, and of course the transit center and public roof park. So here are those buildings placed in the site to reimagine that site through the lens of 2100, containing a lot of elements that I will break down. Here's a look, the vision of the transit center reimagined with connections to adjacent buildings. An image of the street in an attempt to maintain the integrity of the of the ground plane with activity at multiple levels. I've narrowed down the intervention to 4 elements. The first being on the left, a above ground maglev transit system. Maglev is short for magnetic levitation. It's a system of transportation that uses 2 sets of magnets, one set to repel and push the train up off the track, and the other set to move the elevated train ahead, taking advantage of a lack of friction. The friction makes it essentially silent, unlike older models of above ground trains like the L in Chicago that creates distracting noise. The second on the right is higher frequency of roof gardens. And while this is already a growing trend, a greater accessibility with the system through layers of circulation would accelerate the frequency of roof gardens and terraces development. The third is drone package delivery in buildings, either implementing a station for those drones to land or retrofitting their building to allow for it. 1.5 million packages per day in New York City are delivered, bringing chaos to the streets, and it's a growing issue as e-commerce continues to grow. Drone delivery is something that many companies are working on, and I'm assuming that it will be a prevalent utility by 2100. And there is a limit in size, however, that one of those drones can carry, so this would mostly be for smaller packages. The third on the right, I'm sorry, the fourth and final one on the right is our sky lobby connections, or a series of skywalks that connect sky lobbies. So elevators have a height restriction for high-rise buildings. The top floor of that elevator's capacity features a lobby to transition to the next elevator. A series of skywalks would connect those lobbies. And they're typically on the 40th to 50th floor, and again on the 70th to 80th. In most cases, the distance between those buildings justify a ramp in case of misaligning floors. And this allows for inter-building circulation without depending on the ground. And as structures get taller and taller in the future, there's a case to be made for sky lobby structures or sky lobby connections through skywalks as structural bracing to resist building due to high winds. So here's a section of the elevated transit system. It runs down the center of a street, and it is 40 feet wide. And it is structured by a median in the center with 2 levels of mirrored maglev tracks traveling in opposite directions with rider accessibility on either side. In between those levels of maglev tracks is an interstitial package service corridor. The small vehicle represented in the middle, which is a little darker object, would accommodate larger packages that drones couldn't handle. And the system would then connect to the building for allow those packages to be dropped off. The top level is a linear pedestrian park used for walking circulation from building to building, as a public park and as a bike lane. The ground floor would mostly be used for vehicle circulation and some foot traffic. The system overall would collect energy and feature lights underneath to maintain a well-lit street. The height of the system is 75 feet. While the system blocks most sunlight from the ground, the lights maintain the possibility for street function underneath and act as street lights. And then this is a look back at the public park of the transit center as it connects to the right with that linear park. Breaking down the transit system a little further, adjacent buildings will have the option to connect to the system and will be incentivized to do so. It creates an extra level or a couple extra levels of retail space on the top level connection, but also where it connects to the train, to the maglev tracks stations. And the drawing shows different building connections. While floor heights between the system and an adjacent building might not line up, they create different transition solutions using ramps and stairs when necessary. Once every block, there will be a vertical circulation with an elevator and staircase that hugs the outside of the system and connection to a building, and this would indicate a transit stop and station. See that on the left. And while lines intersect, unlike subways that overlap at different levels, this system will feature real-time data communication between cars to avoid collision and increase efficiency. And here's a drawing of all those elements represented in one moment. Each level from the top down is extruded out a bit farther than the next to show spatial conditions. And then a perspective from the top level linear park. And as you see, when the system is not connected to a building, it narrows to maximize the amount of sun that gets to the ground. And then here's a plan of the transit line extension. It essentially mirrors the existing subway line connection locations with some extra lines added. The main reason being the streets are already wide enough in locations where the subways are. The average subway cavity is about 50 feet. For a station where pedestrians enter, compared to 40 feet, the width of the proposed system. The framing of this drawing is important because this proposal, phase one, only covers lower Manhattan and the flood vulnerable areas of lower Manhattan. This defined area makes it a little bit more financially feasible when comparing to other solutions. So a couple calculations here, which I won't break down completely, but as a general number, the average cost per mile of a subway construction is about 900 million. Compared to 60 million, which is the cost per mile of the Shanghai maglev, which is mostly used for long distance travel. But this proposed solution isn't just a train, it contains a linear park, several connections to buildings. Even with those added costs and those features, the total still comes out to be roughly 4.4 billion compared to 37 billion of the NYC MTA fast forward plan, which is a 10-year plan starting this year to fix structural issues, add 11 new lines, new subway cars, a new signal system, and more. In conclusion, I think the system is one that could be applied to many different cities, but Lower Manhattan seems to be the most obvious and most dire need because of damages because of Hurricane Sandy. So we can allow our cities to function at several layers and levels, even in the case of extreme flooding. Thank you.
Michael, what sea levels are your visions based upon, and how much water would be on present day land surfaces?
So by I think 2100, it's predicted like 6.6 foot sea level rise in the northeast coastal area, and then plus storm surges of 9 or 10 feet, which is what Hurricane Sandy roughly reported at. They would that would surpass the berm plan that they have to a landfill. So the elevated portion is about a little above it's about 20 feet off the ground. And so it would cover the sea level rise plus possibilities of storm surge.
Well, then let me revisit a question that we ended on back in December. What about all that vast underground infrastructure besides the subways?
What would be used? Are you saying like how it would be purposed?
How do you deal with that if it's
Yeah.
going to be underwater? I'm talking
So-
underground pipes and sewers and everything.
So there was, as Scott and I were trying to handle how we would deal with that, without getting into too much of the engineering end of it, we thought there could be a possibility to use that interstitial space that I dedicated for a package service corridor. It could be repurposed to, maybe it's not used for package service, maybe it's used for other infrastructures like that, and it would just be completely contained and not accessible to by adjacent buildings. And in terms of the subway that is already there, that could be utilized as a way to flush flooding out of the city. But in terms of sewage and electrical lines, the interstitial space, I guess, would be used potentially for that. But I didn't want to dive too far into it.
All right, well, you did have a slide there making your alternative seem like economically a really good deal. But when you bundle it with all these other expenses and keep in mind that these are private sector buildings here, I think the way this scenario might play out is that they relocate horizontally rather than vertically.
We did have one additional critic join us just now, Marty Summers. Welcome, Marty. Thank you so much for joining us. I think you just got off a review a minute ago from over in Berkeley, and so we're happy we can have you zoom over to New Orleans so quickly. Marty is a professor at University of Kentucky and has a practice plus some studio. But so welcome, Marty. Sorry for the interruption. I just wanted to make sure everybody was aware that you were here now.
Thanks, Ben.
And Carol, did you I think you had your hand raised.
Yes, I did. Thanks, Michael. I guess we all want to see New York City have a future. I'm just wondering, because of his recent very sad death, whether you looked at Michael Sorkin's New York Steady State project, which is all about, it's a years-long project. I think it would be worth looking at. His studio is really dedicated to continuing it, and basically what it wants to do and to accomplish is to make New York ecologically self-sustaining. So the first two pieces of that project had to do with New York feeding itself and New York being able to handle its own waste. So I'm just wondering if you considered at all the ecological impact of this system, which in many ways, perhaps necessarily, but duplicates what's already there. So again, I guess that goes in part to the question already asked, you know, what do you do with the infrastructure that you're replacing? And does it become waste, or does it become something else? Thanks.
Well, ecologically, I mean, there's so many different factors that you can consider when trying to predict what the future of a dense population or a dense metropolitan city like New York would be. And I did, in the beginning, add urban farming to the considerations of how buildings could start to produce their own produce. And while, you know, there is only so many rooftops that you can plant and so much depth of soil that you can grow certain plants. There's I didn't want to add too many eggs into the basket and kind of focus on a few, but as part of kind of the prediction of more utilized rooftops as gardens or public spaces, that could be also another function, is a building producing their own produce or their own farming ecology. And in terms of, again, the infrastructure, like Richard was bringing up, that's a bit of a tougher question that I didn't detail out, but again, I think the simple or the easy answer from my perspective would somehow to be using that interstitial space to kind of reuse the infrastructures, and then the subway system, for instance, that will just be a left cavity in the ground, could be used as a way to flush water out of the city, as what they're doing is landfilling land or soil onto the perimeter of the city, creating a bowl condition similar to New Orleans. There needs to be some way for that water to get out, and maybe the subway could be used for that.
Yasushi, do you have your hand raised? And I mean, I think in general, the formality of the hand raising, I wonder if people just want to jump in, because I might not see all the hands raised in the chat. So if you want to just jump in, just dive in.
Oh, sure. I thought it was a protocol. I don't necessarily want to break the flow of the content of the conversation, but I just have one comment. So I can't wait. But I think I'm finding that so far I've seen 2 projects, and in both cases, that the research, I find the research to be really rigorous, more so than I used to on typical architecture thesis projects. So I really appreciate that, especially in your case, Michael. You sort of did this like financial feasibility analysis as well, which I'm like glad to see. But like coming from a typical architect, designer point of view, what I would love to see was, these kind of, so you had this, if you can sort of like slowly flip through, like you had this image glimpse of what your project might look like. And if I read it correctly, you had this network of all of these places where your system would go, right? Which is a tremendous amount of linear mileage. And I find the way it's rendered here and the glimpse that you showed me is very limited to a very singular resolution of this project, where you have this really wide pedestrian path on the top, which is, largely undesigned. So I would like, again, like from the point of view of what would you do further to develop this project as a potential next step, what I would love to see is something like, I mean, of course, it's impossible to design this whole entire length of the project, but what you could do is, something like the link that I just posted is like for Highline, the one that's built for the competition entry, they did this sort of like axonometric cutaway of that, just a little short chunk of the path, and like the same exact platform can have several different configuration, how many percentage landscape and stuff like that. So I would have, that something like that could be a great next step. Like, this is option 1, obviously, but I would love to see the variations that this system can create.
Yeah, I have a similar comment. I'm also an architect, so I'm really interested in one thing is you bit off a lot of real estate here. And I think seems like you got really into starting to redesign a whole section of New York. And some of that, if you go through the slides, I'm just looking at your slides on another screen, showing all those different building types was really interesting. But the real point of this thesis is really to get down to this maglev elevated station. And so that's what I really would love to see, just this extreme focus on. I do appreciate all of that kind of extra work, because that's a lot of work to kind of redesign a whole portion of the city. But going back to Carol's comment, I think really thinking about what you're doing to kind of protect the area. Not that section of New York is the most beautiful, area, but those tearing buildings down and rebuilding is going to be a big impact on environmentally. So maybe there's some reuse, but I think back to the crux of the design, which to me is kind of like the High Line with this cool magnetic levitating train is really what you should just like focus in on, that one thing. It's almost an engineering project with architecture on top, you know, so you need to really make sure that kind of top, which has this hint of some really cool different types of program, mostly elevated park in most cases that you're showing. Maybe that could have kind of a plug and play program. So you can, if you're next to a commercial space, you can have A, B, C happen. If you're next to a park, this thing can happen. If you're next to whatever this other thing is, because as you travel around New York, you can have a map, which you started to do, of showing where this would actually be, and then really just plug into the existing infrastructure. And then going on to Richard's comments, you know, really integrating all that stuff underground, which is a big deal. So if you were to, you know, have another year or two, which I'm sure you're going to work on this after today, but that's what I would really just focus in on, is like making this super structure that just kind of resolves all of this. And how do you fill in that underground piece? What are you doing with that? Or you have some hydroponic gardens under there or something amazing that's actually helping the solution of maybe this weird underground gardening system, or actually taking some of this flood water and channeling it to other places. So to me, that kind of, that little nugget of the High Line plus the maglev station and the underground is where I would, you know, think about focusing. But it's a really, really interesting, you know, there's a lot to think about with this. So I appreciate the depth you've gone into with this.
You know, I have a kind of maybe a slightly different perspective, which is to say that this project seems to be based on a number of assumptions that I feel like were sort of like not mentioned or kind of discussed very, very quickly, which is to say, like, you know, assumption number one, climate change is irreversible, which I hope not, but maybe that's true. And then there was this other, you know, kind of assumption about like the Hudson Yards and the San Francisco project, that like somehow that urbanism or that kind of development would very quickly replace a neighborhood, which I mean, I don't know about the quality of the urbanism there, but, you know, it's an immigrant community. There's public housing there. I don't know that I would like be so quick to be like, we're just going to bulldoze all that. And, you know, I mean, I'm from the Detroit area, and, you know, there used to be a neighborhood called Black Bottom, which was the kind of like Harlem of Detroit, which is now the site of like a major, you know, freeway interchange. And I mean, this kind of has echoes of that to me. Like, we'll just sort of get rid of public housing and put in a new like futurist toy. So, I mean, I have like those concerns about the project, but there's also a kind of funny way that you go from like the very big picture of you know, these kind of rising floodwaters, and then to a very kind of detailed view of like the sections of this train system. It's a real kind of logistical and infrastructural solution to a problem. And I guess I wonder about the mid view, sort of like, how does this impact the city, and like what's the experience of the city as a result? And I do find it curious that your sections like still maintain a street which is dry. Like, why not show that with water underneath? Like, what, you know what I mean? Like, are there boats? Does it become like Venice with the maglevs running above? Like, sort of why not show it? Why not show it flooded?
Well, I think I didn't anticipate the city to be just perpetually flooded. It was just as a system to allow for a functioning city and transportation in the case of, you know, another Hurricane Sandy, as they are predicted to get more and more frequent. So I still wanted to show the ground plane because it was important to me to still maintain some kind of integrity so that it doesn't end up just being neglected. And now, instead of displacing the ground plane, or instead of multiplying the ground plane and having different levels of equally used layers, I didn't want to just displace it and neglect it. So I think it probably would have been a good idea graphically to show maybe in the section like water and to see, and it would, because it's more importantly used during the case of flooding. So it would have been good to illustrate it in that condition. But the short answer is because I wanted to still emphasize it, yeah, the ground plane.
Michael, perhaps there is where there's some difficulty to have clarity in what your premise is, because I completely agree that the protection of the big U is not, and there was an exhibition in London this March in which I wrote a piece in the catalog, and the big U was one of the projects that were exhibited there, and I was critical with that because it's like you were saying, it's buying time, and actually the big U has been raised in the process of design, has been dramatically raised in height in just 3 or 4 years, and if they take some more time to finish it, it will be higher again. It will be a never-ended design, no, because of the change of the hypothesis. So I really I think that is most pertinent what the question that you are asking, but it's unclear if the question is if your hypothesis is the underground infrastructure is going to be difficult to keep, or if the hypothesis is we need to redefine the ground floor somehow. Because it seemed to me that it was about redefining the ground floor, but at some point you have stopped in the redefining the underground transportation system. And it's unclear because if that's the case, and the street continues the same way, because there's going to be water sometimes, but we are going to pump it up. Well, here we are in New Orleans, no, a few feet under the sea level, and we are still there. So you will be pumping, but you consider that the metro will not be able to be functional. So there's a new metro. So maybe then the metro should be a very light alternative in order to keep the integrity of the street that you want to keep. Or you are really redefining what the street is going to be. And then it's more clear that you are redefining an elevated street on top of, because that's going to be the new ground floor somehow. And then what are all the implications that radical redefinition is? I think there's a little bit of lack of clarity about what is the premise in which you are working. But definitely it's a question that is powerful.
Yeah, I think the initial focus is how to maintain transportation in that portion of the city. And so it was initially a focus on underneath the ground and how to repurpose those infrastructures to be above the ground. But then in that design process, how do you redefine the street? So trying to maintain the integrity of the street, but through a different definition. And I think I could have done some more design. I think as I move forward, I want to focus more on the street because I don't want it to just be, this ground plane waiting for water to collect, but still an active street. Ideally as active as this extra plane that I'm adding on top of it.
Michael, can I suggest you go back a few slides to an image that's more representative of the whole scheme? Any one of those in there would be good.
Okay, we'll do that one.
Or the one after, because you are talking about a second layer of urbanity up above a raised piece of normally hidden infrastructure. The irony is that it doesn't make the street obsolete, and it probably allows the existing subway system to be reutilized in other ways. Some utilities are capable of functioning in wet ground, and other utilities are overly expensive to do so. And so I think in the terrible struggle of a ping pong game where one player keeps hitting you in the direction of taking on more issues, and the other player keeps hitting you on the direction of focusing on one small thing. And you've heard the critics say both of those things today, sometimes the same critic. I think you've done a good job of keeping a wide perspective while trying to zero in on a few pieces to, make it clearer to folks what it is you imagine to be the middle of the investigation that you've been making, which has explored a wide range of scales and issues. And it just while I'm taking up time, I thought I would mention that most of what my students and I have been reading lately say that global warming is certainly still reversible, but not in our lifetime, not in this century. That is to say, even if we stop tomorrow, if we don't put another ounce of carbon in the atmosphere or the oceans, it's still going to take quite a long time for us to get back to the equilibrium that existed before the Industrial Revolution. So it's worthwhile anticipating these kinds of changes in Manhattan and New Orleans, for that matter, as well.
I'm looking at Michael's abstract here, and the title of it is Multiplying the Inhabitable Plane, a Sea Level Rise Defense, which points me to one end of that ping pong table, that everything's connected. It's not just about the subway.
Yeah. I'm trying to point toward the project rather than the title, but but you're absolutely right.
I'll just add that, I think the conversation is really predicated on like a project that is like very detailed and with like a super clear project. And so in some ways I think like we can only have this discussion based on like the excellent work that's been presented. But maybe I do want to ask another question, which is like this project didn't discuss too much in the way of precedents. And I'm thinking of some of the more utopian maybe versions of this. I'm thinking of like Yonah Friedman or Constance New Babylon, this idea of like, the kind of networked city in the air. And I'm curious whether, Michael, you've thought about any other kind of social possibilities that this kind of intervention, could provide. Like, I think we know, we know what like mass transit is. We have probably all been to the High Line, but like, what other possibilities might it offer?
Yeah, well, well, when comparing it to something like the High Line, this is inherently very similar to that with some extra features. That was essentially a park and all of the real estate value. It's a social issue as well as a real estate issue, being that it creates mass and rapid gentrification. But with that, I think the reason that it became such a gentrifying factor is just because of his exclusivity to a specific area. And of course, it's a park. Any area next to a highly designed park is going to be, is the real estate value is going to get jacked up as if, compared to if it wasn't. But because the system is spread out through the whole city, my assumption that is because it is spread out more and it is more accessible, just as any subway stop is accessible to adjacent properties, it wouldn't have as great of a gentrifying factor because of the lack of exclusivity, and it's more widespread. And of course, it would affect adjacent properties. It would force some people to move out, of course, because it is more valuable than just a subway or a subway stop. But yeah, I think that's really the main social implication that I was focusing on is would this really change, the makeup or the neighborhoods adjacent to it? And I think it would, but not quite to the degree of the High Line.
Well, unless if there are no additional questions, I think we can, or comments, I think we can move on to the next presentation. Are there if anybody has anything to add, feel free to jump in. But if not, that's okay. Michael, thank you so much for a clear and cogent project. It's been a real treat to watch this develop over the last couple of semesters. Congratulations.
Thank you.
All righty. Let's see.
Mr. Brereton.
Yes. Can you guys see everything okay?
Yep, looks great. You might want to go to full screen mode, but.
Oh, is it not in full screen mode?
No, it is. Yeah.
Okay.
And
Great.
Henry, I'm going to put in the chat box because the annotation function's not working very well. So you'll get a 3-minute and a 1-minute. Okay.
Okay. Thank you. All right. Hi, guys. My name is Henry Brereton, and this is my thesis project titled Raised Buildings in the Cultural Middle Ground. My thesis director is Scott Bernard. All righty. Let's see. Okay, great. So for my thesis, I wanted to investigate ways in which we can improve the resiliency of the built environment within coastal cities threatened by flooding events. I found like our coastal cities are in danger of an abandonment. It is estimated that there will be roughly $120 billion in damages to homes by 2045. 40% of the US population resides in a coastal county, and 311,000 homes will experience flooding on an average of 26 times a year within the next 30 years. This is a map illustrating the distribution of those forced to evacuate their homes during Hurricane Katrina. The data used to create the map was based on the origin of applications for FEMA assistance across the country. You can see New Orleanians were evacuated to cities and towns all across the nation, some to be with family and friends. Others were sent by FEMA to unfamiliar places just because that's where they needed to go. This is a graphic from one study suggesting that Louisiana will experience a loss of nearly 500,000 people with a projected 1.8 meters of sea level rise. Now, there are numerous opinions as to when the sea level will rise to that height. However, it is pretty likely that it will. It's just a matter of when. And what emerged from my research last semester was the notion that this problem we are facing presents an opportunity to investigate through design how we can reduce the damages done to coastal communities threatened by flooding events and allow those residing in these communities to safely and swiftly repopulate in the wake of a major storm or flooding event. My thesis, titled Raised Buildings in the Cultural Middle Ground, seeks to establish a framework for design thinking regarding the current issues created by sea level rise and flooding that affects coastal cities. This thesis suggests a new way of thinking regarding the occupation of a built environment that responds to environmental changes while remaining mindful of the culture and context of the site. I chose New Orleans as my site, partly because this unique city is the first place I've chosen to live due to its culture and strong sense of community, but mainly because the city is well acquainted with flooding and the long-lasting impact it can have. Throughout the history of the expansion of New Orleans, there has been little desire to densify already existing neighborhoods to accommodate for growing populations. Between 1920 and 1930, nearly every lakeside census tract at least doubled in population. The neighborhood of Lakeview increased by 350%, and Gentilly grew by 636%. All the while, older neighborhoods on higher ground were losing residents. The 1960 census revealed that the population of New Orleans was at its highest in record. Additionally, the census showed that when compared to 1900, when all residents were living on higher ground, nearly half of the residents had moved to an area below sea level in 1960. So this is a map of like the flooding during Hurricane Katrina. The lighter blue represents an area that experienced up to 4 feet of flooding, and the darker blue represents an area that experienced flooding from 8 to 10 feet, depending on the area. During the storm, or after the storm, 134,000 dwelling units were damaged. The population fell from 484,000 in the year 2000, to 230,000 in July of 2006. After Katrina, there was a debate on whether the city should shrink its footprint, and it was suggested that if the population of New Orleans lived in higher neighborhoods in greater density while being surrounded by surge-absorbing wetlands, it would be at much lower risk of storm damage and in turn be more sustainable. This was ultimately rejected, but and then New Orleanians repopulated their neighborhoods at varying rates, proving their resiliency and deep love for their own neighborhoods. It's important to add that the Louisiana Road Home Program's option 1, which is to rebuild in place after the storm, was the most popular of the 3 options among New Orleans residents. This map produced in 2014 illustrates the area or areas that are at higher risk for flood damage, as well as vacant lots around the city. What's important to note is that the sea levels continue to rise and flooding becomes more frequent. Those living in the flood-prone areas will experience so much flooding that it will no longer be feasible to stay in those areas. With that being said, I believe that there will be need for greater density in areas on the fringes of flood zones to accommodate for those wanting to stay in the city. So as you can see, the orange is vacant lots, the dark gray is areas within a 100-year flood zone, and then the lighter gray is the 500-year flood zone. So this was done in 2014, and it's only gotten worse, as you can imagine. So I looked at examples of solutions to intermittent flooding at a variety of scales, and I found that there is an abundance of solutions that lie on either end of the spectrum. On one end, there are low-cost, low-impact solutions, such as these sidewalks constructed in Venice during an aqua alta on the left. On the other end is something much more familiar to New Orleanians, which is our Hurricane Storm Damage Risk Reduction System, or HSD-RRS. The most recent addition to the system was one of the largest civil works projects ever undertaken, which cost roughly $14 billion. And in April of 2019, it was found that the system would no longer provide the 1% level of risk reduction as soon as 2023. As a report made in the Federal Register by the Department of Defense states that Southeast Louisiana, including greater New Orleans area, is generally characterized by weak soils, general subsidence, and the global incidence of sea level rise that will cause levees to require future lifts to sustain performance of the HSD-RRS, and the HSD-RRS project authority did not provide for future lifts. Engineering analysis indicates that the HSD-RRS will no longer provide the 1% of level of risk reduction as early as 2023. So as you can see, there are two sort of, solutions, but I've noticed that there wasn't really anything sort of in the middle that could be a little bit more impactful. So one of the projects I looked at was titled Salty Urbanism by Brooks and Scarpa. They outlined various strategies one could take to rescue housing from flood damage, going from abandonment to flood proofing a building, a raised mound, raised stilts, an amphibious structure, and a floating structure. I stumbled upon this project later on in my research, and it cemented my idea that we cannot rely on walls to keep us safe from rising seas forever. The water will eventually find a way to break through, and the sooner we can embrace it, the easier it will be to reduce the damage it may cause in the built environment. There are already plenty of houses that are raised in coastal areas around the country. Those that choose to raise their home will be all right if their neighborhood takes on about 5 feet of water. But when looking at just the block scale, I was more concerned about the impact flooding has on the block itself. What happens to those who didn't raise their home? After a major flooding event, a block once filled with homes becomes a bleak reminder of the damage caused by flooding once only 2 or 3 families can safely return. I wanted to see if there was a way to allow for every member of a neighborhood to return to their home after a storm. I took a look at some current examples of housing in New Orleans where the residential program was dedicated to a space well above the ground level, thus not being affected by flooding. And each apartment building here put units above the ground level. The construction method varies from building to building, but I began to imagine creating a way for all residential dwellings to rest above an amphibious plinth that can serve multiple functions as time passes and flooding becomes more severe. So as you can see the dash line here, just showing that that level is dedicated to non-residential space. So I recognize that with raising housing comes the possibility of having to sacrifice certain spatial qualities that exist in our neighborhoods today. And I essentially, identified that I wanted to rescue a couple things like the porch culture, cultural events, proximity to neighbors, the informal elaboration of consistent types, the relationship between the street front and the built environment, and extending the useful life of existing buildings. So allowing for those buildings to be raised and be a part of this new raised system. So to begin my design process, I chose to look at the density of 15 neighborhood blocks around the city that lie on the fringes of a flood zone. You can see they're out in this little yellow box here. What I found was that the blocks contained some form of a key lot that was created a unique open condition in the center of each block, as you can see here. I found that these center spaces may allow for a new inverted raised block condition in regards to the street front. And I wonder what it might look like to focus all activity towards the center of each block once the traditional ground level street front is no longer able to be occupied when flooded. So this is sort of that space that's outlined there. And I was just wondering what we could do with it. I chose to express the way in which we may be able to successfully transition to life surrounded by water through a series of block diagrams, illustrating the gradual changes made to the built environment. So initially, I think it's important to understand the original conditions of a New Orleans block consisting of traditional housing types, the Creole cottage, Creole townhouse, single shotgun, double shotgun, and camelback shotgun, and just the density that looks like there. And then this is what we have currently. So on the ground level, it's primarily just residential and potentially commercial program, depending on if it's a commercial corridor. And we obviously have cars parked there, as well as the sidewalks and streets. And then the second level is a residential space or first level for raised housing. But it's most of the buildings now are still resting on the ground plane. Some have decided to raise their homes, but it's not in the majority at all. So the first sort of phase I'm proposing to move forward is to raise all of the housing, whether that be on piers or some sort of amphibious concrete bay system. So the ground level would have raised parking platforms for use during extreme flooding. So you could be able to, drive your car up on top of it. And as well as potentially having amphibious commercial space or residential space that can be easily renovated after a flooding event. The second level would have pedestrian walkways and residential space. And then the third level would also be residential. One thing that's important to note is that with this, what's unique about the New Orleans block is that these key lots allow for one to potentially take a street and extend it all the way through. So creating a link between blocks that wouldn't really affect too much or too many people's homes there. And then, so the next phase is a consolidation of existing conditions. The ground level would be dedicated to elevated car parking that could transition to boat storage or parking as flooding becomes more severe. The second level would have commercial zones, ground floor residential, community space, walkways, and then the third level would be residential. The one thing that's important here is that some of the houses, as you can see right here, there might be one house that's remaining raised, but then the others is like a new construction where each dwelling shares a party wall there. And you can see sort of like what the traditional building would look like in a section in the background. And then for the final phase for the scope of what I've been looking at now would be the living with water phase. The ground level would have strictly boat parking, loading zones for water-based transportation. The second level would have commercial, ground floor residential, community space, walkways and green space. The third level would include residential, green roof, and community space. Yeah, so this is the final phase. And I decided to I picked an actual site in New Orleans to see how this could work. And I wanted to choose 3 blocks off of Ferret Street because I wanted to see how you could intertwine a commercial space and a residential or commercial block and a residential block. And this is what that might look like. This is Ferret Street here with more of a commercial condition with a housing above. And this block back here is more of a strictly residential. And then this is just a quick density calculation just to see how I could potentially double the density. And luckily was able to do that, all the while adding new infrastructure and new green spaces. And these are just some perspectives of what it might look like. This is from a green roof above an apartment overlooking the interior of the block. As you can see, you have a traditional shotgun that was raised and rotated around to face this new street front there. This is what it looks like below with water-based transportation and like a secondary circulation area. And this would be a typical bay below a commercial area where one could drive their boat into and utilize that space. And then this is kind of what I wanted to see what it would look like during Mardi Gras, which is one of more of our bigger cultural events. But yeah, that's that.
Used to be one of our bigger cultural events.
Yeah.
Exactly. Sorry, like I feel like if you guys don't mind while my baby's quiet, I'm just gonna speak very quickly. I think it's a great. Sorry, your name?
Henry.
Henry, yeah. Sorry. So Henry, yeah, that's a great project. I really love the series of diagrams showing the different phases of different scenario, different phases. That was very clear, and I think it's very telling. And like I'm also glad to see all these visualization of like new potential architectural typologies of your future scenarios. So that's all great. So since you executed so well, it really begs, again, what to do next, right? So I'm like, I can't help, partially because I happen to, teach structures classes as well, even though I'm not an engineer. So the next step to become more realistic, what I beg to ask is the foundation, right? So I imagine the soil in New Orleans to be not very solid. So you probably have a very solid soil, soft clay or some sort of soft soil, which I guess, I'm not too familiar with the float house, even though Marty and Ben and I worked at Moses. So maybe if you guys remember that project, you can speak to the aspect. But the idea of a floating house, I think that thing ends up needing a lot of, sturdy foundation. So I think adds up cost in terms of, trying to have the foundation that can sustain all these things that's on top. So your scenario of continuing to build on top is very intriguing. But, I think to be practical, I think, for one to expect all these added load on top, I think you have to start with a really substantial foundation, which I think basically, it's a really large cost at upfront. So that's a big investment at upfront, and then I think while it's being flooded, I think the soil gets even weaker, right? It gets eroded and stuff. So maybe that even further enforces the need for substantial foundation. So I'm just kind of coming from the previous project that had some sort of a financial calculation. I mean, whether it's precise or not, I guess I would love to see a speculation of how much added cost it would be in the very beginning to sort of expect this scenario, and may or may not be feasible, but I think that sort of evaluation would be great to see, I think.
Yeah, I agree. I think moving forward, definitely figuring out a way to sort of wrap my head around that, and being able to compare it to the cost of our flood wall system that we have now, just to see, how, what would be a better option in the future. I mentioned earlier just how, the current flood wall system, it is sinking, and they just put in $14 billion into it, and it's disappointing to see that all that money went to something that won't provide adequate protection in 3 years time. So maybe this costs somewhere similar to that, but I think that this is embracing water, and hopefully would be longer lasting in the long run. But
yeah, I mean, you did the great job as an architect. These images, like I would love to see the Mardi Gras on water. I mean, even though as a connotation of what it would mean to the people, that's that probably also has a negative connotation, but just as a spectacle, I mean, that's architect's job, right, to sell your project. So I think that part you did great.
Thank you.
Yeah, I agree. This is like exceptionally well visualized. It's very convincing in that respect. I guess my questions have to do with, again, the kind of foundational assumptions of the project. And it seemed as though like there's a kind of implicit assumption or belief in the project that the culture of New Orleans is sort of integrated, or was formed to a large extent by the physical, the kind of the physical disposition of the environment, like the porches, of course, the landscape and the water, but that there's some kind of like, sort of integral relationship between the street life and the cultural events that happen there, and the physical kind of environment that in which it takes place. And so in your scenarios, if so far as I understood what your argument was, that there's an intermittent flooding, which houses could kind of rise up or have these kind of temporary platforms. And then there's this scenario, which is that like water inundates and sort of never leaves, and so the whole city has to sort of be permanently raised up. And I'm kind of wondering about I'm thinking about the nature of like insurance in this company and the laws around like FEMA, and the ways in which, I've mostly kind of read about this in the context of Houston, but there are places in the world where like they will just keep flooding, and we can kind of keep putting money into it to rebuild over and over again, or there's another option, which is to like build on higher ground. And so my question is like, to what extent does it make sense to is this culture like really inherent to this place? And if you change the environment this much, does culture not necessarily have to sort of change along with it? And at a certain point, like, is this really is this the New Orleans that has developed over the past couple of hundred years, or is this something new and different, which might necessarily force culture to change to some extent?
That's a really good point. I think driving all of like the moves that I've been making, and sort of the assumption that people will always want to be here and behave the way that they do based on the built environment, is just how people came back after Katrina, and really were very had the strong opinion of, I'm gonna go back to my neighborhood, I'm going to make it the best that I can. And unfortunately, it took a lot longer for those neighborhoods to come back, and a lot didn't. But yeah, it's a good question, because I'm not really sure where the cutoff point would be. When is this no longer the place that it used to be? So yeah, something that I'm gonna have to keep thinking about.
Project was really well presented. A few caveats here. So Yasushi mentioned the Make It Right float house. I worked on that for about 2 weeks when it was still a UCLA project, and Tom needed it to be tuned up in the office a little. So that was my job. but I also kind of partially grew up in New Orleans in a way because I would go down there every summer. My sister lived in East New Orleans, Lafayette. Still have extended family in Metairie, so I know the place somewhat from childhood, right? So I'm looking at this and imagining the New Orleans I remember and the images that I saw post Katrina. And I went down, saw Make It Right, saw the Lower Ninth, and the difference between my childhood memories of New Orleans and the New Orleans I saw post Katrina were so radically different. And I'm wondering for you relative to this project, I think what Tom tried to do with Make It Right was to propose a kind of radical scenario for the city, which was basically this doesn't make sense to build in the low areas. It doesn't make sense for anyone, right? It's not economically sustainable for the city itself because if we're assuming these things are going to happen over and over, you have to do something, right? So your proposal is trying to find that middle ground between we have to densify and say you can't use the lowlands. You're proposing this alternate, which is no, the lowlands actually are now matte buildings where we're basically producing a second Chicago. So we're going to lift the entire city up a story and just give up the ground plane. And I think along with that, there's a question there, which is really about a kind of transition phase. How would you imagine the moments when it's not flooded? Or is it your idea that you would kind of take this massive effort, citywide, federal government involved, huge amounts of money to lift everything and kind of produce a new datum of New Orleans and then open up the floodgates? Is that your proposal?
Yeah, I wouldn't say so, and it's something that I'm still trying to grapple with is like what the order would be for all of this, and with how things are being flooded now, we're experiencing a lot of I forget the term for it, but just like a lot of flooding just due to high periods of rainfall and things like that. So not just levees breaking and hurricanes, but things like that. And there already are areas that are so low in the city. So I guess what I'm thinking about though is putting this the best place for this project within the city are areas that lie on the fringes of already pretty heavy flood zones that experience flooding already today. Just sort of see how that would work and then move forward as time passes and as flooding becomes more severe. I think that will sort of ultimately lead to like what the next steps would be, but it's something that I'm still really trying to figure out myself.
I think though, as a student, your opportunity is to be a little more radical about it.
Mm-hmm.
And to really propose something and say, I don't know enough to know the consequences, but damn it, I'm going to try,
Right.
And I think the problem you're setting up is one where, so you're in the fringe area, but what happens to the low area? Everybody immediately gets wiped out again. And so then you have to say, well, no, we actually can't build in the low area, or we're going to do this everywhere and just accept the fact that this is the, COVID-19, this is the new normal, right? And the new normal is the city is flooded and it's always flooded. And we just adapt to this new condition, which I think then invents a kind of a new type of housing. I think the comment about culture is fantastic. It would totally change the culture.
Right. Yeah, I think that there will be some sort of tipping point where we have to accept that these areas will be flooded, and I don't think that it's like going to be a scenario where we just open the floodgates, but it'll happen over time. And unfortunately, I think the more responsible thing to do would be to obviously tell people, okay, the sea level's at this height, with another big storm, your neighborhood's going to be wiped out. You need to move. But I referenced earlier in my presentation just how that, after Katrina, people still wanted to go back so badly. And so I'm having a hard time, proposing, twisting people's arms and saying like, you have to leave your neighborhood and move to a higher neighborhood. At least it's not out of the city, but it's still there. So I don't know.
Henry,
One last comment, sorry.
The statistic about how many people came back to the city, but in a different house?
I believe so. I'm gonna have to find it, but I think it was like a third of the people that came back were no longer in the home that they left before Katrina. So at least a third had to relocate anyways.
I think one thing that would really strengthen your project, and I'll be quiet after this, would be to look at the infrastructural damage that occurred. So many of the pipes and systems that pumped water out of the city, and the cost to repair and replace all of that, and the cost of pumping, right, over time. If you just look at those numbers, you could knock off a certain chunk of what it would take to actually build this up. And I think you would start to make an argument for why doing it now at current dollars versus doing it 25 years from now when everything's twice as much makes an economic sense to, a social, cultural, environmental problem.
Yeah, that's great. I agree. Thank you.
I think both Iñaki and Carol have their hands raised. I'm not sure which was first, but whomever would like to jump in, dive in.
I think Iñaki was first. Are you saying go ahead? Okay. All right. So thanks so much, Henry. So I just want to congratulate you actually on the research piece of this, the mapping studies, the diagram. For me, they provide another kind of forward-looking level of what we've learned and what we know about what happened post-Katrina. As there's the kind of tiny question and then the bigger question. So I wasn't sure. The tiny question is, what happens to the cars in all this? Because I'm thinking about what we all do with our cars when there's a rain. We scurry to get them to someplace where they'll be safe, but that's not so important. What I'm really interested, I'd love to see would be some sense of a design of transitional zones. So we know that some areas of the city are safer than others. So what would it look like? I think would be very interesting to explore at the points where maybe your elevated blocks meet blocks that are less elevated or not elevated at all. So what sort of general topography of the city would eventually occur or might occur in stages, as other people have asked?
Yeah, I think it would be really interesting to create like a giant section of the city, showing the soup bowl, and just maybe trying to like wrap my head around like how you could bridge the gap between the ground plane, like occupying the ground plane and that raised plane. So that'd be something really good to look at moving forward. I'm not sure exactly how that would turn out, but I think it's very important. So
Henry,
and where do your cars go? Here?
Oh yeah.
Where do they go for safety?
So in one of the phases I had, there would be this raised sort of portion of below a house in this sort of concrete bay where you could drive your car up onto a higher portion. But with like the last phase, that's assuming that we're no longer able to use cars unless someone creates an amphibious.
Why don't you show that section? Why don't you go back to that section diagram?
Oh yeah, sure. Let's see. Sorry, it's gonna take a second. Okay, so here's a good one. There'd be a way to drive your car up onto this portion here, and then when it's flooded, this becomes like a bay for a boat to come in, and so yeah, that was the idea there.
Iñaki?
Yes, Henry. I think like Michael's below before, these are very fascinating and provocative questions and deserve the thesis title, no? And these are, with hypotheses that are probably leading to a failure because there's no convincing solution. So that's a proof that is a real investigation. No, it's like the inventions. No, the first airplane was a big failure. It jumped like a horse. No, imagine. And then everything that was developed after that. No? So I really applaud both of you, and I think that these tough questions that are not solved and that have only partial answers is really interesting. I'm just following the comments of Martin and Carol about the change and the swap. And how much is this, because this is an intermediate condition, but it's a kind of ideal intermediate condition in which everything around is white and clean, and there's a section with a car that you don't know how it arrives there. So that my question is if this is a complete swap, if this is a process, if this is a messy mix of different situations, how like the flood maps, no, in which you are building different situations and changes over time and in different conditions. What would it mean in terms for the project to have that temporal condition, this kind of process condition, and this kind of a little bit more messy, and that is not very clear how the floats that now ride over
yes,
and we have to extend our hands to get the throws. Now the floats are going to be floating under us and are going to throw the throws up. No, is this a swap? No joke, but how this swap is produced, no? I'm intrigued about all the messy conditions of the in-between, no? Clearly, a situation like the last image of the axon, a following one, claims for what Martin was asking for. You are just saying it doesn't make sense to keep the flood walls and the pumping stations and all that stuff, and we just open the doors and let the water begin to take over in a regular base, and let's stop the maintenance of the switch and waterboard pumping system, and now let's think in the drainage in a different way, and now we'll take care of the black waters and the drinking waters. But the drainage we are going to manage in a completely different way. No, that's probably a hypothesis that you are talking about. But again, then there's the different situations in different parts of the city, which are the higher grounds, the not so high grounds that Carol was asking for, etc. So thank you. Really, lots of questions that I think that's what a thesis should raise. No.
Yeah, thank you very much.
I have a couple of questions. One is, I think one of your most compelling slides was the vacant lots on the flood zone, 100-year and 500-year flood zones. Mm-hmm. And I think that could be a really interesting place to go for maybe one of these sections that Carol was suggesting. But, kind of analyzing why the vacant lots are they kind of economic based or cultural based, or, you know, of course it has to do with the flood, but why are people not going back there? And that was from 2014. So we have 8 years of missing data. So it'd be interesting to see if there's an updated version of that, if people had rebuilt on these lots at all. So that's one thing I would look into. Did you kind of explore that a little bit to see if you could find more data?
Yeah, I tried to find like some more recent data of like what the land use was, or just the lots now, and it was kind of tricky, but it's something that I'm still trying to wrap my head around, what it looks like today, because development is so different now than it was. Right. So
a couple of other things. One is cultural, and then one structural. So structurally, you know, if you're adding these kind of bigger 3-story options, you know, that's gonna, in theory, displace the sponge a little bit more than it is at this point. So you kind of have to be careful with exactly what you're proposing, and building up is never the best solution in New Orleans, especially on these kind of really low grounds of New Orleans, even though you're only going up a story, but your renderings make it look like maybe a lot of concrete. I'm not quite sure what all the materials are. But then along with that, I think the question keeps coming up on if your plan is to have this like a 100% flooded, you know, proposal, or if it's kind of partial. And then if you go back to that section that you just had on the screen, maybe the next slide. Yeah, so all of these little sections show about, I don't know, 2 feet of floodwater. And so begs the question of, you know, New Orleans is already raised in most conditions. We have a lot of, I lived in New Orleans during college. So there were a lot of, you know, shotgun houses that were raised 2-3 feet up. And so, you know, even the section you showed of the cultural aspect of having people on their porch and watching the parade, you can see that person sitting up on a little plinth already. So in that case, why the drastic raise in height just to get a boat under there, when in most cases you wouldn't want to park your boat there, you know, throughout, I don't know, for 10 years until it was really needed. So what was your thinking behind that?
Yeah, so early on, when I was trying to kind of create phases, I had it raised up just 12 feet. And then I brought it up to 15 so that it would be, you'd be able to have your boat, you know, in there, and it would still be like a livable, or, you know, occupiable space if the water rose up. It's not like you're hitting your head on all of that. But yeah, I honestly, I'm not sure how. I think like a big thing that I want to continue to work on is just how that sort of space below the livable space can be more functional. I mentioned in one of the earlier phases how it could act as partially commercial, and maybe all of the important program that needs to stay dry is raised up on that higher level where the cars, you can see the car parked now. But then like the lower space, say it was a restaurant, was more like the dining space or something like that, or if it was a store. How can that sort of be repurposed and be as functional as possible in each phase? And so I think that's I'm gonna have to keep looking at that.
Yeah, it's almost like you're in a bit of a ping pong situation, like Scott was saying on last one. It's like, well, do I want to go, you know, full on flood, or, you know, it's like you're just kind of divided between the two. So I think having a really good stance on that, like Martin was saying earlier, and making a bigger proposal, just like, okay, I'm going to take this huge swath of New Orleans and do this kind of crazy thing to it, I think would really help. I think culturally, it's a really interesting idea. I also lived in San Antonio, Texas, where they have a river, and there are river parades. And it is a different experience, you know, to see something from above, look down on these floats versus kind of seeing this, you know, live Mardi Gras in person. We're just kind of standing next to the people. So that would be just kind of an interesting architectural thing to visualize a little bit further if you were to kind of sell this to the city or whatever it is. But good job.
Thank you.
I'm just going to dive in here. I think we've got to keep moving here. But I did want to give a shout out to see if Rich Campanella had wanted to discuss anything about this project very briefly. Resident expert on all things water in New Orleans.
I gave Rich a $50 check not to chime in on this topic. I don't want you blowing my investment.
I already spent it on Amazon.
Great to hear it. Well, anyways, maybe that's we should segue to the next project. Afterward, Henry, maybe you'd want to drop Rich a few more $50 gift certificates to Amazon to sort it out. Not sure, but really wonderful project. Thanks for showing it, Henry, and thanks for all the wonderful comments. We will now jump to our last presenter of the afternoon, Xiaolan, who has been working.
Can you enable my screen sharing?
You must have. Did you leave and then come back for a brief moment?
No, I only stopped video.
I thought I'd given you hosting. Okay, you should have hosting status now. All right, Xiaolan, and I really appreciate your background image. Very appropriate.
Thank you. I'm trying to sell my design.
Nice.
And Xiaolan, I'll put the time 3 minutes and 1 minute in the chat.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Thanks, everybody.
Hi, I'm Xiaolan. I've worked on my thesis Harbor Tide with Professor Kentaro Tsubaki on the topic of improving the living situation of the urban population in Hong Kong. So I'm proposing residential solutions to the housing crisis and living problems in Hong Kong by building floating communities in Victoria Harbor. Hong Kong, a city of 7.5 million people, is one of the world's densest and the most unequal place to live. The population density is not as high as New York City, but the population distribution is highly concentrated in the urban center. And the peak density is more than 100,000 people per square kilometer. Housing is not affordable to the local population. The housing price and rents in Hong Kong are higher than New York City, London, or Paris for apartments less than half the size. The price of a typical home in Hong Kong costs more than 20 times the median salary, and there are 210,000 Hong Kong residents living in one of the city's thousands of illegally subdivided apartments. For example, one of these original 640 square feet apartments is divided into 4 subdivided apartments, 48 square feet each, with severe fire safety and air quality issues. Currently, over 250,000 people are waiting for access to public housing. However, the city's affordable housing program has not kept up. This map shows the entire land territory of Hong Kong. The 4 main areas are Kowloon, Hong Kong Island, and these 2 are adjacent to Victoria Harbor here, and New Territories and Lantau Island. So Hong Kong was handed back to Chinese authorities as a special administrative region in 1997. It has a high degree of autonomy in all matters except for foreign and defense policy for 50 years, allows freedom of speech and association, and is dominated by an open and market-driven economy. In Hong Kong, land is government-owned and controlled. For years, the government has followed a policy to sell leases of land through auction and tender. It represents up to 30% of government income. On the contrary of its highly developed economy, Hong Kong has an extremely dense population distribution. The highest district has more than 60,000 people per square kilometer. The population density is determined by the building distribution. If we look at the building footprints, we can see linear settlements along the two sides of the harbor, while the inner land remains almost vacant. And I'll explain the reason later. And this map shows social service apartments in yellow. However, due to the big housing need, shortage of housing, the average time for public housing is 5.5 years for general applicants and families, and 3 years for single elderly applicants. In this map, the red shows bed space apartment. It refers to a house that contains 12 or more people who rent individual bed spaces, also known as cage home or coffin home. It is legal to rent bed space apartments, but property owners must obtain a special license from the bed space apartment ordinance. And the rent for this bed space is around $300 per month. So in order to house all the local population, how many houses do we need to provide? Based on population growth projection and current housing amount, if we use average data 3 people per unit, we will need at least 1.26 million units by the end of this century. And if we take a typical 30-floor residential high-rise in Hong Kong as an example, 8 units per floor, we will need 5,250 high rises to house everyone. And the government is planning on a reclamation project called Lantau Tomorrow Vision, which will be the world's largest man-made islands. It will cost $64 billion US, half of the city's fiscal reserve, and yet will only meet 30% of the gap. And it will cause permanent damage to the environment along with the sea level rise. And these 4 bubble zones will be the new reclamation islands. And when it's done, it will be the densest area in Hong Kong. To rethink the size and the cost of living, I looked at Alejandro Aravina's affordable housing project in Chile. Instead of building a full small house, it is possible to provide half of a good house by including self-construction strategy. In this case, residents would purchase or rent half of the house and expand it in the future. First, it would lower the construction cost for the government to build more houses with the same amount of money, which means instead of building typical 600 square foot units, which takes a skilled worker more than 20 years to afford one, we only build 400 square feet. And the owners can expand the unit to 800 square feet based on their financial situation. And second, it provides a lower price for the owners to purchase. With a $21,000 down payment and $450 monthly payment, we have we'll have 30% of houses for sale and 70% for renting. The renting units would be $300 per month. And the income from the owners would be used to build more units in the future phases. With the $64 billion from the reclamation project, we can build 48% units of the housing need and in the first phase. And it would take about 2.18 square mile of the water area, which would be about 35% of the reclamation project. And this is a typical modular unit. Each unit has 2 stories. 4 10 by 10 by 8 modules on 1 story. Both can be expanded from 2 modules to 4 modules. And on the left is the initial unit with 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom, a kitchen, and living/dining space. And on the right is the expanded unit with more functional rooms customized by the owner. And this is the neighborhood aggregated by 28 units with 2 units stacked and 4 stories in total. And the modular units would be prefabricated in factories and transported to the site to lower the budget. So where can we build these houses? Hong Kong has a land area of more than 400 square miles, yet there's only 16.8% of land for urban and suburban development, and only 6.8% for housing development. There's a large area of country parks on steep slopes, and 70% of Hong Kong is countryside, and 75% is hills and slopes. Overlap with existing building areas between steep slopes, protected parks, and high density neighborhood, Hong Kong has little land for new housing development. Considering the entire territory, including water, I overlap ferry routes and freight shipping areas and got this non-buildable area map. And the inverted map shows the buildable area in purple and mostly on the water. Since there's not much land to build on, the only way to expand is to build on the water. And this shows the public transportation system. Public transportation is highly developed and important to people in Hong Kong. The red lines are primary roads and blue lines are railways. And Hong Kong has a type of vernacular architecture built above water called stilt houses. These were created by one of the earliest inhabitants who rely on fishing for their livelihood. And today they still inhabited and also for tourism purposes. So based on buildable area, public transportation system, and land use along the coastline, I picked my main sites over like this wide areas, and to start the first phase of the floating community. And this is zoomed in Victoria Harbor. The white solid lines are roads, and the dashed lines are railways. The red dots are on the railways are the stations, and with a radius of 2-minute walking distance. The blue dashed lines are existing ferry routes, and I'm proposing to add a ferry route next to the former airport and to form a loop here. And this will be the main site for the development. And the construction phase will start from the 2 ends on the coastlines and connected in the middle. And on the coastline where the floating community connects to the land, this edge condition will be redesigned to transit from existing context with high rises to the new horizontal community. The colors highlighted different land use. Pink is commercial, yellow is residential, green is park, blue is transportation, and purple is industrial. And these functions will affect the functions of the coastline. To explore methods of urban development and architecture growth on the water in a horizontal direction, I looked at 3 presidents from the 1960s, Kenzo Tange's Plan for Tokyo, Le Corbusier's Venice Hospital, and Una Friedman's Will Spatial. Kenzo Tange's Plan for Tokyo has a very detailed hierarchy of circulation systems, from the civic access branch to the residential area and then to the neighborhoods. So I followed this concept in my design and built my community from the coastline to primary paths and then to each neighborhood. And Venice Hospital used the concept of map building, starting from minimal units to care units and then building units to repeat and grow from that. In my design, the individual units aggregated to into neighborhoods and then to the communities. And Una Friedman had developed mobile architecture theories. He proposed a new living pattern with homogeneous circulation, group living, and homogeneous distribution of living units, which I used in the extension of the communities. And Friedman proposed building space frame structures above the ground or water surface and filling modules into the structure, which he called the process trial and error. In my case, the government will build structures for each neighborhood and unit and then fill by residents. The theories behind the presidents are metabolism, map building, and mobile urbanism and architecture. I tried to extract the concept and found many overlaps, such as module, flexibility, and change. So from this, I came up with 3 strategies I would push in my design: horizontal, flexible, and autonomic. Horizontal provides more accessibility to nature. Flexible allows change and adaptation in the long term. And autonomic means the residents have more power to create their own living space. This is the plan of a neighborhood, which borrowed from the form from another vernacular architecture in Hong Kong called walled village. The living units enclose a communal space in the center. The communal space has functional areas for sitting, gathering, growing plants, and swimming. It takes the advantage of floating in the harbor and provides water activities. And here, different levels within this limited space gives the residents more spatial feel. And then the neighborhood again. There are entries on each corner and 3 staircases connect the 2 levels. And each upper level unit has a roof garden. So the platform on the bottom is made of lightweight concrete floating tube tied to the harbor bed by chains. And this is a variation of barrier-free unit combined with retail unit on the upper floor. And the retail unit concept came up with from the living culture in Hong Kong, which is people run small business on the street level and live above. This is showing how the community grows. So each community includes 5 neighborhoods with a water plaza here and a dock at the end. Between the residential communities, there will be public facilities like schools, offices, markets, or malls serving the surrounding residents. And this strategy will reduce the population density to about 20,000 people per square kilometer. This is a view looking at the water plaza, a street view. This is public market and office and residential. This is the site plan. And the section shows the contrast between the horizontal community and the dense high rises on the back. The red zone is showing the weekly tides in Victoria Harbor from about 2 feet to 6 feet, and the community will rise and fall with the tides. And the coastline is designed into different levels. So currently in this photo, it is isolated from the land or the water. In order to connect the city and the water, I added pocket gardens here on the existing street level. And when you come down, there is another bike lane and pedestrian level with retail stores on one side. And when you pass the retaining wall here, there is a continuous stairs facing the water surface. And here's the connection to the new community. And this is the section view of the new coastline. And this is what will happen with the sea level rise in the future. So it prevents flooding and stores a certain amount of water. And at the end, I just want to point out the living crisis is one of the most severe and urgent problems in Hong Kong. And the Hong Kong government is already working on the solutions or planning on projects, but most of them are very controversial. And it is unpredictable what the policy will be after 2047. So I think right now is the best time to introduce this new way of living to the city. Thank you.
In times of rough weather, you mentioned the chains and anchoring devices there that would seem to permit for quite a bit of jostling, lateral jostling. And I'm wondering, is the water too deep there to allow for pilings, and your mats would be moored to them, so they would just slide up and down the pilings and reduce the jostling? Or is the water too deep for that?
So the water is not, the water is about 120 feet. And, but there is some underwater tunnels for railways.
Would that preclude pilings then?
I'm not sure. I don't think. I'm not sure about piling.
If pilings cannot be done there, then it seems like your design would have to be flexible and fluid enough to accommodate quite a bit of lateral jostling. And the way you had those boardwalks and interconnecting roads, I'm not sure that flexibility was there.
Mm-hmm. So, so the roads would be like connected to these platforms, and these are connected from these chains to the bedrock.
Oh, those are going into the bedrock there?
Yes.
Okay.
So something along that line again, my baby's about to cry, so I'll try to wrap up quickly. I think, I mean, first I like, I mean, this is another project with really strong research, and your visualization diagrams, those were excellent, and including the renderings at the end. So I'm really, so it's whatever your project is, oftentimes, I mean, I've reviewed some weak projects in the past week as well. But the strong projects, in my mind, whatever your view is, you have represented the vision for your project, and this is how my project is going to look like. What it's going to do. All that was super clear in your diagrams and visual communication. So first, applaud to you on that one. Like and because you executed that so well, it makes me want to talk something other than your project, which is, I mean, it's a good sign that you did a great job on your project. So therefore, I can't help ask, some of the practical questions. And like all these housing problem projects is something that makes me feel unfortunate to be an architect, because oftentimes, in most cases, it's not architect's fault, right? Like the reason why that's happening is the policies and something that's outside of our typical professional responsibilities. I mean, except for maybe we can, as architects or AIA, can do some kind of a lobbying or something like that, to affect the policies. I would be, well, actually, I wouldn't be ashamed to confess that majority of my knowledge now comes from YouTube video, but I watched this one video on Hong Kong housing shortage, which I'll post the link later. It talks, which probably you're aware, the reason that the housing shortage or land scarcity, the reason for super high price for Hong Kong housing is not necessarily the land scarcity, apparently, but it's more of a land use policy problem. And apparently, from what I've learned, the government also earns a lot of money from leasing a tiny piece of land to these corporations or developers for really high money, and therefore, as a result, Hong Kong government can stay. They can maintain the really low tax, apparently. So these super high land price for Hong Kong government is apparently really positive thing in terms of investment and stuff. So that's first question, right? So that's where I feel as an architect, what can we propose? Because in the era of metabolism, we could propose this super, I mean, those are great times, right? Like those projects, whether it's feasible or not, it just looks awesome. And it's very, with the optimistic atmosphere of 60s, it feels like the great way forward. So now, sorry, I'm a little bit getting sidetracked, but we can't, like now the problems becoming more and more clear that it's on the policy side, and there's only limited things that architects can do, not your fault. So because of that, right? So like, am I criticizing you or student for not solving that issue? Not really, right? But so if you, I mean, this is your architecture thesis at architecture school, so that thing actually doesn't matter ultimately whether your proposal is actually going to work or not. But in that aspect, I think if you're going to propose something, I mean, you're doing really outrageous, not meaning the negative meaning, but like really large scale move, being, putting these structures on the ocean. So that's a really grand gesture, right? I mean, it's as equally a grand gesture as Tange's or metabolism's move of these sort of megalomaniac structure. So there's that attitude. And on the other side, the architecture you produced, the visualization, even though you did a really good job of representing it, it has this feel of this sort of suburban housing. So it's a very sort of a conservative, sort of safe architecture, which to me, it's a very sort of interesting and strange mismatch between these two attitudes. What you're doing I mean, I personally think that I agree with the earlier comment about the foundation. You know, it's gonna do this. So I'll question. I would imagine this to have a really sort of heavyweight structure, piling, a lot of piling going into the ocean bed. So there's a huge investment there, right? So arguing that there's going to be a low density thing on top of that, it's a little bit of a tough sell. But you know, don't think your project was not valid. I mean, you did a great job representing everything. Therefore, we are being enabled to have this kind of discussion outside of what you did. So not a criticism, but just wanted to bring up the point.
Thank you.
Yeah, I agree with what you just said. Yeah, the presentation of the research was just really methodical, super clear, and the drawings are beautiful. But I also saw a kind of mismatch between the radical gesture of placing this housing on the water, and yet the housing itself is like, yeah, I mean, as you said, kind of conservative. And I mean, I think the difference between this and the precedents that you showed was that those are just so much more like infrastructural in scale, right? Like that you can really imagine sort of, you know, tens or hundreds of thousands of people being housed or, you know, contained in those kind of utopian projects. And this seems so light in comparison. Those floating neighborhoods, I mean, it really is just kind of like a suburban block in some ways. And so there is a sort of mismatch to me as well with the idea that this is somehow replacing like social housing, particularly because this offers such a respite from the density of the city that, I mean, this seems to me like it would be very quickly sort of sucked up by like, you know, elites who, you know, want to have like the ocean view and want to have like a much less sort of dense living situation. It's really hard to imagine this, you know, kind of being supported by, you know, kind of like low income housing or public housing. The other thing that seems missing from these drawings is like all of the infrastructure underneath of these things to carry like water and waste and electricity. Like there's a kind of whole network of stuff that it seems like would need to happen underneath of these things in order for them to function.
Yeah, I agree. Kintaro and I talked about it, and I think there would be another whole system to support the maintenance and other like sewage and garbage and stuff.
I just wanted to jump in and say, agreeing with everyone, this is a really thorough, really great presentation. None of us are asking you why you chose that site because it was very thorough on your site analysis. And so that's a really great skill that you have. So I maybe in contrast to what Elizabeth was just saying, I kind of appreciate the maybe underwhelming architecture just because I did my thesis on low-income housing 17 years ago at Tulane, and I've advised students on low-income housing theses, and it's a really hard thing to solve, obviously, like Yashushi was alluding to. But I think at the end of the day, you don't want to make something accessible that looks super kind of out of this world. So if it's meant to look accessible, I think your architecture actually complements that really well. The idea of this floating on the water, I think, is just so kind of out of this world and fantastic. I do have the same questions about, might get a little seasick. Maybe that's not the best solution. Those little skinny boardwalks look like they might break, but you know, at the same time, I think your approach to this whole design are really fantastic, and your process and your presentation were super thorough. So I would really congratulate you on that.
Thank you.
Xiaolan, thank you for the proposal. It's super exciting. I think that your investigation is spectacular. I've learned a lot. I have so it's exciting because you were mentioning a mat building strategy, and it's a kind of mat islanding strategy what you are doing. So how is 4 stories will be enough? Is this density of little islands enough? Or it seems like this is a kind of the reverse to Susu, in which the placement of the city comes with a strategy in bringing the water from the Yangtze to that territory in a much more controlled way that locating the city in the banks of such a river. You're doing the opposite. You are going to the water to organize this. How would it look like when this housing crisis requires you to have double? Will you grow in height, or would you add much more? And what we are seeing here, a kind of groups of islands, will be much more a kind of mat building or mat island system, in which what you will have in between will be channels somehow. So with a more connected system in between these pieces. I'm really curious and interested. I think again the development is spectacular and allows for a lot of questions. That again is what the thesis needs to provoke. I'm just curious about why you have reproduced a kind of standard block system, and why there's a sidewalk in the outside the perimeter, when why don't the housing units reach the water somehow and establish a different relation with a potential transportation in water directly to the houses? What can this allow or not allow for these blocks to relate to each other in different ways and to create stronger clusters? And if that makes sense also in terms of accessing always from the inside courtyard to the housing units, much more protected. We can imagine here storms and other things. What would you imagine different configurations of these blocks with accessing and relations?
I think when I started doing this project, I was considering to lower the cost, as much as possible. So I think using the same patterns or layout of the neighborhoods would be the best for to solve this housing crisis problem. I think the first the most important thing is to house more people, and also this modular units can be added to more units on the top. So I think this is a start, and it's like a first phase to solve this problem. And I try to use the same modules of this neighborhoods to create a different experience for in these communities. And I think it's for your question, is the budget. I was considering.
So I think we have probably time for one more comment. So we have a little bit of time left for wrap up, as well as not taking too much of our critics' time past 5.
I raised my hand, Ben. I
Oh,
won't
great.
take much time, but thank you. This is just a beautiful project. I would just love, I mean, doesn't need any more sort of weight, but I would have loved to have seen a consideration of the sort of cultural values. You know, it seems to me that these are so special. I can imagine, you know, it's a typology that was, you know, imagined for the a very of urban inhabitant on the periphery of Latin American cities, right? But it seems to me that, you know, these would sort of rapidly become the most desirable properties in Hong Kong. So I'm just very curious to think about that, that cultural implication, the economic implication, and the way they would be received and the way they actually might accrue in value fabulously, right? Even though the model derived in a very different economic sector. Thank you.
Thank you. I think I did consider about like making this attractive to people. So it's like solving the housing crisis, and also is good investment for people to own the house and like making some like values from it.
I'll just add one comment, and that's been the one that's been bugging me the whole time. Sorry, Ben.
That's okay. We still have
presentation. Well done. I think the last comment is true, which is you've made an appealing place that would immediately price everyone out of the market. And so if the housing crisis is about people who can't afford, then you almost kind of need to invert the problem and say, where are the spaces in the city that aren't used and maybe aren't useful in other ways, so that they're devalued, but you could bring value to? That I think the kind of waterfront is the most valuable, and therefore would become a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. You build it, and then immediately people want that because it's a contradiction to the environment, which is hyper dense. You're producing low density housing, and everybody's going to want low density if their daily life is super high density, right? I won't say everybody, a good chunk of people would. And so I think what you'd want to look for are the kind of stranger zones within the city that make it a little harder to develop, or for whatever reason that Yasushi described, are kind of outside of those rules. I think immediately of Gordon Matta Clark in New York City finding all the leftover lots that were unbuildable and going around and buying all those lots, to imagine a kind of other potential infrastructure that could be created out of lack of value.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So just to chime in, I mean, yeah, this was exactly my point, kind of going back to Betsy's comment. It isn't that I think that the architecture needs to be more spectacular. It's that the low density itself becomes luxury in comparison with the rest of the city. And so I actually think it would be beneficial to go back to some of the precedents, particularly the map buildings, and to think of like, if this is one layer, if this, you know, doubles or triples or quadruples, and that there are additional kind of connections at a higher level, would that, I mean, instead of like only having connections at the water level, if there were multiple connections, it becomes like a 3-dimensional net, which has to maintain some flexibility. It's not that it's rigid, but does that actually solve some of the structural issues or the experiential issues of the water, right? Having the thing become more stable in that it has more connections vertically as well as horizontally. So I think a kind of 3-dimensionality to this, to the project could actually benefit it. And the reason is because the the cost of the architecture, that's not the primary cost. The primary cost is everything underneath, right? And so once you have to, once you do the pilings or the floating system and the anchors, it's like building upwards, that seems like a much smaller part of the cost then of the project.
Great. Well, Shawan, tremendous project, a lot of good feedback there. It was a pleasure to watch this project emerge over the last couple of semesters. You really landed on something I think significant and contributes to the conversation that's taking place in Hong Kong. So thank you. I would like to turn it over to a more general conversation. So maybe if you want to stop sharing your screen, Shawan. Thank you. I had a great time today. I mean, I thought all the presentations, first to the students, I thought it was, really wonderful to see all of your hard work and see very cogent presentations on highly developed research projects. I thought all of the feedback was extremely useful and beneficial to further development of ideas, as well as sort of contextualizing some of the broader and more specific issues latent within each of the works. I would like to turn it over to the critics for any kind of general observations or comments. One thing I do want to say is that in this delamination from undergraduate and graduate theses, one of the primary pushes this year has been the development of well-executed research. And thinking about architecture as a discipline that deserves a clear research methodology and that it can be identified and digested. And presented. And so that some of the comments we're picking up on the deep investigation of research, I really appreciated those comments because that was one of the motives of this semester. I would like to hear from all of you what your general observations from the day were, thoughts, concerns, issues we can improve upon, etc. I'm open for anything.
Now, like Yasushi said a minute ago, I've been on some bad reviews this week. And I think in a lot of cases, it's a lot like studios that I would run in that I throw too much at students and try to get them into a place where they have to make smart decisions about what they focus on, because that's ultimately what practice is. You've got a million things going on. How do you select and be strategic about what it is you focus on to get through to the next phase of the project without losing the conceptual idea? And I think in the work that I saw, sorry I was late to it, but the work that I saw today, there's a very high level of research and representation that's commendable because I've seen other projects that are aspiring to something along these lines that don't reach on either. The research isn't developed and the work itself doesn't represent very well. And so the projects that I've seen should be highly commended for that. I think the struggle as a student would be you don't have enough experience to know some of these things. And so that makes it hard. Like in this last project, I'm immediately thinking about all the other things that might happen in a city where the city might need to acquire land. I'm thinking of like autonomous vehicles and other things like that. Like, could you link up another problem with housing that allows housing to become the secondary problem, meaning you make housing affordable because they need to build this other thing and you just piggyback onto it, right? I think there are strategic ways to think about those problems where you don't get so focused in, but that's the point of thesis, is you really deep dive and focus. So it's like it's a critique, but not a critique. It's a recognition of the issue, and it's a lot for one person to do. So I'm impressed.
I think I'll try to be quick. I'm really impressed with everyone's work. Like Marty was saying, my typical review is always, I don't know, like a good third of the projects where we're arguing like, oh, so what did you try to do? Or did you try to do this, right? Like, so in that sense, like everyone did a great job of like manifesting and executing what you were trying to do. So it was super clear what you guys are trying to do. And actually myself included, when I did thesis, it's super hard to like pick your position, right? Like, this is what I'm gonna do. Like like I spent, I guess, 90% of the semester, like, is this right? Is this right? Should I do this? Should I not do this? Right? So, because it's very tempting, like, especially when you're younger, like you tend to try to solve everything, which you can't. So in that sense, I always try to use analogy and I don't come up with a good one, but it's like you're like, it's clear that, like, for example, you were trying to make a cheeseburger and you made a really good cheeseburger. Therefore, it allows a conversation where it's like, well, like cheeseburger, there's too much fat and too much carbs, and so you should use more. If the conversation is like that, that means you did a great job, right? Because you cannot make cheeseburger and veggie wrap at the same time and turn it into one thing. Like oftentimes you end up with either cheeseburger, sort of veggie wrap, unidentifiable, ambiguous, indecisive something. And right, so I didn't see any of that. So I think, so that's the compliment for everybody.
So yeah, I agree with all of the other comments. I mean, having just gone through thesis reviews at my institution, like I'm definitely going to be checking with Ben later to pick your brain about how you ran some of these things, because the work is, I mean, it's just so kind of cohesive and beautifully presented and beautifully rendered, and so it was really like wonderful to see the work. If I had to say that one maybe aspect was missing, and I understand that like these presentations are limited and you have a lot that you've been working on for a whole year, so you might have just edited this out, but I'm thinking of Sarah Whiting's article that she wrote about the master's thesis, and she uses this analogy of the banquet, right? That you, and I'm kind of forgetting how she articulated it, but the point is that you are kind of entering into a conversation among other thinkers and other designers who are tackling some of these same issues, and I think it's different than the idea of precedent, right? Because it really has to do with the impact that you want the research to make, and so it's like, to what extent were you able to sort of look at other projects dealing with the same problems? Can you articulate what is sort of missing from those earlier arguments or earlier proposals that your thesis is then like kind of filling in, and to what extent are you aware of the contribution that your work is making? And so that is sometimes like hard to be able to articulate, like when you're in the middle of it. And so maybe, maybe next year, like maybe 10 years down the road, like this will become more clear. But I mean, at least, in the world of scholarship, right? It's actually super important to be able to make those claims, like as you're making the argument. So that would be the one thing I would ask is like, can you articulate the significance of your proposals, maybe?
Yeah, I'll chime in. I think one thing we ask a lot of our thesis students to think about is, what is your contribution to the field of design or architecture? And so that's a really hard thing to just put into one sentence. But if you can say that and really quickly at the beginning, at the end, I think that's just something to always kind of reiterate as you're writing your thesis or exploring these concepts. But I do want to commend everyone on very thorough presentations. All 4 of the subjects we looked at, design build across the US, is something that I'm sure everyone at different institutions is trying to figure out how to do this in their school. We certainly are. So we have a program in place, and now I want to pick your brain more, Kaylin, on how to improve this. Flooding in New York, flooding in New Orleans, those are huge issues that everyone worries about. A lot of climate change factors coming into all of these projects. So that's actually good to know that everyone is kind of looking forward into the future in terms of how they can solve these large issues. And then housing in Hong Kong, I mean, that's like a gigantic issue. still forward thinking on how you're kind of approaching this. So I would say really good job, everyone, on picking a really complicated issue and trying your best to dissect it. That's why a thesis is hard, because you have to like kind of internalize all of these things and produce something in writing in a presentation. So kudos to everybody.
So if I can jump, so I was a bit scared coming to this review, and I am very pleased after this afternoon because I'm pleased of the relevance of the themes that you have tackled. Very different to some other thesis reviews in that there's a lot of self-indulgency, and for me it's extremely irritating. So that's why I was so scared, and I'm happy to have been invited. Thank you, Ben. I think that the hypotheses were serious. There were rigorous investigations on data, and I think the diagnoses were, for the most part, very successful. And as in any big try, the failures have been splendorous. All the projects were falling short, and that's thankfully. If not, they wouldn't have been a thesis, no? But they are raising a lot of questions, and they have the potential for each of you to become springboards for you to jump further, as opposed to dead ends of something that is satisfactory for you but will lead nowhere. I think in all the cases, your thesis investigations have the capacity of leading you way far. So I really appreciate that this has been intellectual explorations and brain explorations instead of gut explorations, which are really not interesting. I think that really tackling important topics that are really difficult and no problem in falling short and not being complete. I think it's really something that I applaud way beyond personal obsessions to really tackle things that are relevant and that are contributions, small contributions, of course, because that's how architecture works in a very, very small incremental steps. So thank you for the invitation.
Well, thank you everybody for a fantastic first day of the new version of Graduate Thesis. Again, it's been a wild ride for me this year, and man, to do this all while having to jump to home or to wherever and finish this work remotely over the last 6-8 weeks. I can't even express how much I am proud of all of you. It's been a tremendous effort, and I really look forward to seeing what's next in all of your futures. Tomorrow we will have the second version, day 2, and some of the critics will be joining us tomorrow as well. And I really look forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you all so much, and I hope you have a great rest of the semester and the beginning of a great summer. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Congratulations.